The letter arrived on Michael Brennan's 35th birthday, wedged between a disconnection notice from the electric company and final papers from his divorce attorney. He sat in his 2008 Ford pickup outside a Portland strip mall, engine off to save gas, watching his daughter Lily sleep in the back seat with her threadbare stuffed bear clutched against her chest. The bear had a name once. Michael couldn't remember it anymore. That's what 3 months of living in a truck did to a man. It erased the small things first, then worked its way toward the center. His hands rested on the steering wheel. Calloused hands, scarred hands, hands that had built homes for other people but couldn't keep his own family housed. The tremor in his fingers was slight, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Michael was always looking for it these days. Checking, monitoring, making sure the shaking stayed manageable, making sure it didn't get worse. The envelope from Baker and Associates, Clearwater, Montana, felt thick. Official, the kind of weight that meant complications. Michael had learned to hate complications. They cost money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. But the return address triggered something in his memory, something old and buried and sharp around the edges. Clearwater, Montana, the place social workers had taken him from when he was 8 years old, pulling him out of his grandparents' ranch house while the old man and woman stood on the porch and did nothing to stop it. 27 years ago, might as well have been yesterday for how fresh the anger still felt. He opened the envelope with hands that wanted to shake harder. Inside, documents stamped with county seals. A property deed, a letter from Howard Baker, attorney at law, explaining that William and Margaret Harper, grandparents Michael barely remembered, had died within months of each other and left him 400 acres called Thunder Ridge Ranch. The words blurred as exhaustion pressed down on him like a physical weight. 35 years old, a carpenter with no contracts, a father with $847 standing between survival and catastrophe, a daughter who deserved better than gym showers and library bathrooms. The ranch sat in a state he'd left 2 decades ago, torn from the only home he'd known by people who'd promised his grandparents were too old, too unfit, too dangerous to raise a grieving 8-year-old boy. He'd believed them. He'd hated William and Margaret Harper for letting him go without a fight, for standing on that porch like statues while strangers loaded his life into a sedan and drove him toward a future of foster homes and unanswered questions. Lily stirred in the back seat. Her voice came small, muzzy with interrupted sleep. "Do we have to go back to the library today?" Michael looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. 8 years old, same age he'd been when everything changed. Her hair needed washing. Her dress came from Goodwill, 2 sizes salvaged and safety pinned at the hem because new clothes were luxuries and luxuries were fantasies. She was looking at him with eyes that held too much understanding for a child. Eyes that knew they were living in a truck. Eyes that knew Daddy cried at night when he thought she was sleeping. "We might not have to go anywhere for a while, baby." Her face lit up with hope that made his chest ache. The hope of children who've learned to expect disappointment but haven't quite stopped believing in miracles. That hope was a knife. It cut deeper than anything Jessica had said when she'd walked out 3 months ago. Deeper than the rejection letters from 40 construction companies. Deeper than the looks from other parents at the library who recognized homelessness when they saw it. He read the letter again. 400 acres, a ranch house, barn, outbuildings, all his now, apparently, all waiting in Montana like ghosts he'd tried to forget. The attorney wanted him to come sign papers, wanted him to see the property, wanted him to understand, Michael suspected, just how worthless this inheritance really was. But worthless was relative when you were living in a truck. Baker's office occupied the ground floor of a brick building in downtown Clearwater that smelled like old money and older grudges. The town itself looked like every other dying Montana settlement Michael had seen in movies. Wide streets built for a population that never came. Storefronts with faded paint and optimistic hours. Mountains in the distance that promised freedom the town couldn't deliver. The drive had taken 9 hours through landscapes that shifted from coastal rain to high desert to mountain passes, where snow still clung to north-facing slopes in late spring. Lily had been quiet most of the trip, coloring in a donated activity book, asking questions Michael didn't have good answers for. "Are we going to live there, Daddy?" "I don't know yet, baby." "Will there be other kids?" "Maybe. Do you think great-grandma and great-grandpa would have liked me?" Michael had to pull over at that one. had to breathe through the sudden tightness in his throat before he could answer. They would have loved you, sweetheart. They would have loved you so much. Howard Baker himself was everything Michael expected and despised on sight. 60-something. Brooks Brothers, suit that cost more than Michael made in a month back when he was making months. Cufflinks that caught the afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked Main Street. The kind of man who measured worth in bank balances and judged people by their shoes. His eyes traveled over Michael's Carhartt jacket with its sawdust and oil stains, over Lily's Goodwill dress with its safety pins, and his expression said everything his mouth was too polished to speak. He gestured toward leather chairs they were clearly meant to feel unworthy of. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Signatures, initials, dates scratched across pages with the sound of finality. Baker's pen was heavy, expensive, the kind of pen that signed important documents and dismissed unimportant people. When the last signature was complete, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers in a gesture Michael recognized from every authority figure who'd ever told him what he couldn't do. Mr. Brennan, I must be frank. Men who said they must be frank were never about to say anything good. Thunder Ridge Ranch has been essentially abandoned for 15 years. The structures are unsound. The land is overgrown. Your grandparents, God rest them, ceased all maintenance activities in their final years. The property requires, by conservative estimate, $500,000 in restoration work. Baker paused. Let that number settle. Let it do its work. You're a carpenter, an unemployed carpenter with a dependent child. Blackwell Development has offered $200,000 for the entire parcel. Given your circumstances, accepting that offer would be the sensible course. The name Blackwell triggered something. Michael couldn't place it. Just a feeling, a shadow moving at the edge of his vision. They've been trying to acquire that land for over a decade, Baker continued. Senator Blackwell personally authorized the offer. It's generous considering the condition. I've seen the inspection reports. You'd need heavy equipment just to make the house habitable. The barn's half collapsed. Fencing is gone. This isn't a weekend project, Mr. Brennan. This is a money pit you can't afford. Something in the man's tone, the practiced dismissal, the assumption of incompetence, sparked anger Michael hadn't felt in months. He'd spent 20 years building things with his hands, framing houses, raising walls, creating shelter where none existed. This attorney knew nothing about him except his bank balance and current address, yet spoke as if those metrics defined the sum of his capabilities, as if poverty was proof of failure, as if struggling meant worthless. I'll need to see the property first. Baker's expression soured like milk left in sun. Of course. But when you realize the scope of what you're facing, my office will facilitate the sale to Blackwell Development. The offer expires in 30 days. I'd advise against wasting time on false hopes. Outside, Lily tugged his sleeve. Her small hand was warm through the fabric of his jacket. Why was that man so mean? Some people think money makes them better than everyone else, baby. They're wrong. But the words felt hollow even as he said them. Baker wasn't wrong about the money. He wasn't wrong about Michael's circumstances. He was just cruel about the delivery. Cruelty from comfort. The easiest kind. The second envelope had been tucked inside the first. Smaller. Hand addressed in shaky cursive that must have cost Margaret Brennan tremendous effort near the end. Michael opened it sitting in the truck while Lily colored in her activity book, and the words inside rewrote everything he'd believed about his childhood. My dearest Michael, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means we've passed and you've come home. We never abandoned you. They took you from us, you. The handwriting wavered across the page like a drunk man's walk, like someone whose hands betrayed them, like someone fighting against time and failing. Your grandfather discovered something terrible, people being killed, buried beneath construction projects. When he tried to report it, they used the courts against us. Social services, custody hearings, all manufactured to silence him. We let you go to keep you alive. They threatened you, Michael. An 8-year-old boy was leveraged against an old rancher. Everything he learned, he preserved. The study, the key, the truth that cost us our family. Come home. Finish what he started. They thought we'd forgotten. We never did. Michael read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. The words didn't change. The implications didn't soften. 27 years of resentment. 27 years of believing he'd been unwanted. 27 years of carrying abandonment like a stone in his chest. All of it built on lies. All of it weaponized by people whose names he didn't even know. His grandmother's signature at the bottom was barely legible. Margaret Harper, a woman who'd died alone, who'd spent her final years knowing her grandson believed she hadn't loved him, who'd carried that grief to whatever came after because powerful people had decided one old rancher knew too much. Lily looked up from her coloring book. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The calluses caught on his stubble. He needed to shave, needed to shower, needed to be someone other than a 35-year-old man weeping in a truck outside a Montana attorney's office while his daughter watched. "Because I was wrong about something for a very long time, sweetheart." "What were you wrong about?" "That some people didn't love me." "Turns out they did. They loved me more than I knew." She reached forward and squeezed his shoulder. Her hand was so small, so trusting, so certain that Daddy would figure this out because Daddy always figured things out. The faith of children was another knife. It demanded you become worthy of it. The ranch materialized like a broken promise as they turned off the county road onto a dirt track marked with a faded sign. Thunder Ridge Ranch, private property. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and rust that looked like the land was on fire. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and gray and eternal. Grassland rolled away in every direction, interrupted only by fence posts without fences and structures that had surrendered to time and weather. The main house sagged under a failing roof. White paint peeled away in long curls to expose gray wood beneath. Windows gaped empty or were boarded over with plywood that had weathered to the same color as the siding. The wraparound porch listed dangerously, columns cracked and rails hanging loose like broken teeth. It looked like a place where hope had died slowly, room by room, year by year. The barn's red paint had weathered to bare timber. Its northwest corner had collapsed inward where the roof had given way, creating a wound in the structure that let the dying light pour through. Outbuildings stood in various states of surrender. A tool shed with no roof, a chicken coop leaning 30 degrees off vertical, a garage with rust-frozen doors hanging open on emptiness. Sage and wild grass had reclaimed everything in a tide of green that made the decay somehow worse. Nature was indifferent to human failure. It didn't mourn. It just grew over the bones and moved on. Lily pressed against the window, eyes wide. "This is ours?" The question hit harder than she meant. This ruin, this testament to neglect, this physical manifestation of everything that had been taken and lost and forgotten. "Yeah, baby, this is home." The lie tasted bitter but necessary. Home was supposed to mean safety, warmth, permanence. This was just a place where those things used to exist. Inside, the house smelled of abandonment, dust and mildew and time's slow rot. Furniture crouched under yellowed sheets like sleeping ghosts. On the mantel, family photographs watched through dusty glass. William and Margaret Harper, young and strong, in a wedding portrait from another era. In one frame, Michael had to lift and wipe clean to recognize himself. 8 years old, flanked by grandparents who smiled with unguarded joy. The last moment before social workers arrived and everything shattered. He stared at that photo for a long time, tried to remember that day, tried to recall feeling that happy. The memory was there but faded, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. He remembered the weight of his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, remembered his grandmother's laugh, remembered feeling like he belonged somewhere. Then the memory stopped, cut off clean. The next clear recollection was sitting in the back of a social worker's sedan, watching the ranch disappear in the rear window while his grandparents stood on that porch and did nothing. Except they had done something. They'd let him go. They'd made the hardest choice. They traded their grandson's presence for his safety and spent the rest of their lives living with that wound. The kitchen still held dishes in the sink, fossilized by decades. Margaret's apron hung on its hook, fabric faded but somehow still carrying the ghost of her presence. Down the hall, 3 bedrooms waited in various states of preservation. Michael's old room stopped him in the doorway. The bed was made, toys arranged on shelves, drawings still taped to walls, everything frozen exactly as he'd left it. A shrine to a childhood interrupted. His grandparents had kept it like a museum, like they'd believed he might come back any day. Like hope was something you maintained through action, even when reason said it was pointless. Lily explored with quiet wonder, touching the carved wooden animals on the shelf, picking up books whose pages had yellowed with waiting. "You lived here?" Her voice held awe as if this ruin was a palace. "For 6 months after my parents died. These were the happiest months I had left." The admission hurt to voice, hurt to acknowledge, hurt to realize that 8 years old was the last time he'd felt truly safe, and even that had been taken. "Why did you leave?" "Bad people made me." He crouched to her level, gripping her shoulders, looking into eyes that trusted him completely, that believed Daddy could protect her from bad people and broken promises, and a world that didn't care about little girls living in trucks. "But we're not leaving now. No matter what happens, we're not leaving. Okay?" She nodded, solemn. "Okay, Daddy." The study door at the hall's end was locked with hardware different from every other room. Heavy, industrial. The kind of lock that said something valuable lived behind it, or something dangerous. Michael tried the key from Baker's office, tried it in the front door, the bedrooms, the closets. It worked everywhere except here. He remembered his grandmother's letter, the study, the key, the truth. William Harper had loved puzzles, loved teaching Michael to think sideways, to see what others missed. Hollowed books, he'd say, false bottoms, compartments built in plain sight. The world is full of secrets for people smart enough to look. The living room shelves held hundreds of volumes, spines sun-faded and dust-caked. Michael started pulling them down, checking weights, riffling pages, looking for the hollow, looking for the secret, looking for his grandfather's last gift. Lily helped without being asked. She had a gift for that, for knowing when to help and when to be quiet and when to just exist alongside him like a small anchor, keeping him from drifting too far into dark water. They worked through the lower shelves together, created organized stacks, wiped covers clean, found nothing but books and dust and the smell of old paper. An hour passed, then another. The light outside faded from amber to purple to the deep blue that came before true dark. Michael was starting to believe they'd need to break the door down when Lily reached the top shelf and pulled down a leather-bound copy of Treasure Island that felt wrong in her small hands. "Daddy, this one's light." He took the book. She was right. Too light, the weight was off. He opened it carefully and found that the pages had been carved out with surgical precision, creating a hollow space lined with felt. Inside, a brass key attached to a note in William's distinctive handwriting. "For Michael, when he comes home. Truth is in the study. Be careful, son. Some secrets are kept for good reasons. Some because powerful people want them hidden. What you find in that room cost us you, but might also lead to justice for people waiting a long time for someone to care enough to look. Trust your instincts. Know everything we did because we loved you more than our own safety." Michael's throat closed. His grandfather's voice came through in the words. The cadence, the careful phrasing, the love wrapped in warning, wrapped in hope. This man he barely remembered had spent years building something, had sacrificed everything, had waited in faith that someday his grandson would come home and care enough to look. The key turned smoothly in the study lock. The door swung inward on hinges someone had maintained even as the rest of the house crumbled. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then held steady, revealing what William Harper had spent a decade building while his heart broke from missing his grandson. Every wall was covered, maps marked with colored pins, red for incident locations, blue for connected individuals, yellow for the missing. 23 yellow pins, each bearing a name and photograph. Young faces, smiling faces, faces that had no idea they were already dead when those pictures were taken. Newspaper clippings overlap police reports, overlap property records, overlap surveillance photographs. Red yarn connected points in a web of conspiracy that spanned the room. Filing cabinets lined one wall, drawers labeled by year. A desk dominated the center, buried under notebooks filled with William's meticulous handwriting. Evidence catalogs, cross-references that must have taken years to compile. This wasn't a study. This was a war room. This was what happened when one man refused to stop fighting even after they'd taken away everything he loved. Lily's small voice barely registered over the ringing in Michael's ears. "What is this place?" Michael looked at the yellow pins, at the missing faces, at the timeline stretching back 30 years, at evidence of something so vast and terrible that it had cost him his grandparents and cost 23 people their lives and cost who knew how many families their peace. Grandpa was investigating something, baby. Something that took a lot of people away from their families. Did he find them? Michael lifted the first notebook, dated 1995, and opened to the first entry. His grandfather's handwriting was steady then, strong, before age and grief made the letters shake. I don't know yet, but I'm going to read everything he wrote and find out. The entries began mundane, ranch business, weather observations, notes about an 8-year-old grandson settling in after tragedy. Then March 14th, 1995. Found something disturbing in North Pasture near Devil's Creek today. Ground disturbance. Fresh. Professional. Not surveyors. Not animals. Purpose unclear but wrong. Marked location. Photographed. Installed cameras. The investigation spiraled from there with methodical precision. Within weeks, William had captured night footage of men with equipment, vehicles without plates, coordinated operations that vanished before dawn. He'd started asking questions in Clearwater, carefully, and learned other ranchers had noticed similar activity but been dismissed by law enforcement. The notebooks detailed months of research into property records, shell companies purchasing land and patterns that surrounded the ranch like a noose. William had discovered disappearances, 23 spanning 3 decades, all classified as runaways or accidents, numbers far too high for a rural area with steady population. He tried reporting everything to state police, FBI, journalists. Every avenue had terminated in dead ends or active obstruction. Then, 5 days before social services arrived, his handwriting grew urgent. They know. House searched while Margaret and Michael in town. Papers disturbed. They know I have evidence. Afraid, not for myself, but for Margaret, and especially Michael. If they'll disappear people to protect secrets, what will they do to an old rancher? Michael is leverage. As long as he's with us, they can threaten him. Have to let him go to keep him alive. We'll preserve evidence. Wait, hope he returns when safe. Michael's hands shook, holding the notebook. The pages blurred. He had to set it down before he tore it. Before rage and grief turned physical, and he destroyed the very thing his grandfather had died protecting. Lily had fallen asleep on the study couch, wrapped in a blanket from the truck. 1 a.m. had become 2, then 3. Michael read, absorbed, understood. His grandparents hadn't abandoned him. They'd sacrificed him to save him, then spent 20 years maintaining this room, this evidence, this proof, all while living with the knowledge that their grandson believed they hadn't wanted him. The grief was physical, a weight pressing his lungs, a blade between his ribs. 27 years of resentment for people who'd loved him more than their own happiness. 27 years of carrying anger that should have been directed at the ones who'd weaponized a little boy to silence an old man who'd seen too much. Dawn found him hollow and certain. The yellow pins on the map weren't just names, they were daughters, sons, futures erased. 23 families living with the same unknowing he'd carried, except their loved ones were actually gone. Not just separated, gone. William had built a case strong enough to prosecute. He documented patterns, preserved evidence, cross-referenced decades of crimes. He'd been 5 days from presenting everything when they'd shut him down by taking the one thing that could make him stop. 27 years later, his grandson held the same evidence and faced the same question. Stay safe or finish the fight. Michael looked at his daughter sleeping, at the war room his grandfather had built, at his own reflection in the window against the Montana dawn. He looked like William, same jaw, same hands, same stubborn set to his shoulders that Jessica used to complain about. That genetic inheritance meant something. Blood meant something. Legacy meant something. The flask in his glove compartment had been calling to him all night. Just one drink. Just something to take the edge off. Just enough to make this bearable. He'd been good lately, hadn't touched it in weeks. But this was different. This was heavy. This was the kind of weight that justified a drink, that earned a drink, that required a drink to process. He walked to the truck, opened the glove compartment. The flask was there. Silver, dented, half full of whiskey that would burn going down and numb everything after. His hand closed around it. Cool metal, familiar weight, old friend promising old comfort. Then he looked back at the house, at the light still burning in the study, at Lily's small shape visible through the window. At the ranch, his grandparents had kept waiting for him. At the evidence they'd preserved, at the choice they'd made to let him go rather than let him die. They'd sacrificed everything, given up their grandson, lived with grief, died alone, all to preserve the possibility that someday he might come back and care enough to finish what they'd started. What was he willing to sacrifice? What was his truth worth? What legacy would he leave Lily? A father who drank away hard things? Or a father who stood up when standing up cost everything? Michael walked to the porch, unscrewed the flask, poured the whiskey onto the ground, watched it sink into Montana soil. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a guarantee. It was just a choice, one choice, today. Tomorrow would have its own choices. But today, this morning, with his grandfather's evidence waiting and his daughter sleeping and the weight of 23 murdered people demanding someone care, Michael Brennan chose to be sober. He chose to fight. He chose to finish what William Harper had started. The sun was rising over Thunder Ridge Ranch, amber light on broken structures and wild grass and possibilities that looked impossible but might not be. The house needed work. The barn needed work. Everything needed work. But Michael was a carpenter. He knew how to build, knew how to restore, knew how to take broken things and make them whole. Maybe he could do the same for himself. Maybe he could do the same for his grandfather's memory. Maybe he could do the same for 23 families who deserve to know what happened to their children. Maybe it was enough to start. Lily woke hungry as the sun cleared the mountains. They drove to Clearwater for breakfast at a diner called Till's that looked like it had served the same menu since 1970. The waitress, Marge according to her name tag, smiled with practiced warmth while other patrons studied them with mountain suspicion. News traveled fast in small towns. The Harper Ranch changing hands was probably the biggest thing to happen in Clearwater since the last time something bigger happened. A rancher named Pete Simmons approached their table, 60s, work-worn hands, face that had seen the weather and knew how to read it. Heard you're William's grandson. Sorry for your loss. He was a good man, stubborn, but good. Thank you. Pete shifted his weight, the tell of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed. Blackwell Development's got a good offer on that land. You'd be smart to take it. Ain't nothing out there worth saving, son. Place has been dying since before William passed. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let dead things rest. I appreciate the advice. Pete nodded, walked back to his table. But Michael had seen something in the man's eyes, something that looked like relief or maybe fear. Hard to tell which. 3 more people stopped by before their pancakes arrived, all with condolences, all with advice about Blackwell's generosity, all with the same underlying message. Take the money. Leave. Let it go. In the truck afterward, Lily asked why everyone wanted them to sell. Small towns have long memories and longer loyalties. Sometimes those loyalties don't align with justice. What does that mean? It means some people know things they don't talk about, and they'd prefer if we didn't talk about them either. Back at the ranch, Michael's phone, clinging to 1 bar of signal, delivered a voicemail from Portland. Another construction company declining his application. That made 40 rejections in 60 days. His bank account showed $829 between survival and catastrophe. Blackwell's $200,000 could solve every immediate problem, could fund a fresh start somewhere employment existed, could give Lily stability, could give Michael breathing room to figure out what came next. It would also mean walking away from 23 families who deserved answers. Walking away from grandparents who'd bet everything that their grandson would care enough to finish what they'd started. Walking away from the man he wanted to be to embrace the man's circumstances were trying to make him. The decision crystallized standing in William's war room, looking at those yellow pins, reading those names, seeing those faces. They deserve better than to be forgotten. They deserve better than to be collateral damage in someone's plan for economic development. They deserve justice. And maybe Michael Brennan, 35-year-old carpenter with $829 and no prospects, maybe he deserved the chance to be someone who stood for something, even if it cost him, especially if it cost him, because that's what his grandparents had done. That's the example they'd set. That's the inheritance that mattered more than 400 acres or $200,000 or any amount of money. We stay, he said to the empty room, to Lily sleeping in the next room, to the ghost of William Harper who'd built this war room and waited, to himself. We stay. The words felt like commitment and foolishness in equal measure, but they also felt right, felt true, felt like the first honest choice he'd made in months, maybe years. His phone rang. Unknown number. Michael almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers meant collections agencies or scammers or bad news wearing a smile. But something made him pick up. A voice came through, older, rough. The kind of rough that came from cigarettes and hard living and carrying weight. Michael Brennan, my name is Frank Dalton. I'm the man who failed your grandfather, and I'd like a chance to not fail you. The line hung there, words floating in digital space between two men who didn't know each other, but were connected by the ghost of a third. Michael looked at the war room, at the evidence, at the yellow pins, at everything his grandfather had built and preserved and protected. Who are you? Someone who has answers. Someone who has regrets. Someone who's been waiting 27 years for William's grandson to come home. Can we meet? Tomorrow morning. Your ranch. I have things you need to see. Things I should have acted on a long time ago. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. But I'm asking anyway, 9 a.m. I'll bring coffee and evidence and a guilt I can't wash off. What you do with any of it is up to you. The call ended. Michael stood holding the phone. Outside, the Montana wind moved through grass that had grown wild in the years his grandparents had maintained a vigil. Tomorrow, a stranger would arrive claiming connection to William, claiming evidence, claiming regret. Tomorrow was 12 hours away. Tonight was now. Michael walked through the ranch house, room by room, touching walls his grandfather had built, running hands over furniture his grandmother had chosen, standing in doorways where their lives had happened, where they'd loved each other, where they'd loved him, where they'd made the choice to let him go. He found his old room again, sat on the bed that was too small now, looked at the tays that had waited 37 years for hands that had grown too big to hold them properly. On the dresser, a photograph in a simple frame, Michael at 7, his parents young and alive and smiling, his mother's hand on his shoulder, his father's arm around her waist, a family that existed for 7 years before a drunk driver turned it into memory. After his parents died, William and Margaret had taken him in, had given him 6 months of safety, 6 months of healing, 6 months of believing family meant something permanent. Then the social workers came. Then the court orders came. Then the separation came. Then the foster homes came. Then the group homes came. Then the aging out came. Then the adulthood with no foundation came. Then Jessica came and left. Then Lily came and stayed. Then everything that led to this moment, to this ranch, to this choice, to this inheritance. Michael lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling. His daughter slept down the hall. A stranger would arrive tomorrow. 23 dead people demanded justice. His grandparents' sacrifice demanded meaning. His own future demanded he decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The weight of it should have been crushing. Should have sent him back to the truck for another flask. Should have driven him to accept Blackwell's money and run. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground he'd stood on in years. It felt like purpose. It felt like the thing he'd been missing since Jessica walked out, since he lost his job, since he started living in a truck with his daughter. Direction, meaning, a reason to be sober, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, one ordinary man with nothing but determination could make a difference. His grandfather had believed it, had lived it, had died believing it. Tomorrow would bring Frank Dalton in whatever truth he carried. Tomorrow would bring decisions and complications in the real beginning of whatever this was becoming. Tomorrow would test whether Michael's resolve survived contact with reality. But tonight, in a house that remembered love, on a bed that had waited 27 years, Michael Brennan slept without drinking, slept without nightmares, slept with his daughter safe down the hall and the ghosts of his grandparents finally able to rest because their grandson had come home. The inheritance wasn't the land, wasn't the house, wasn't the money he could get from selling. The inheritance was the fight, the evidence, the responsibility, the choice to stand when standing cost everything. That's what William and Margaret Harper had left him. That's what they'd preserved. That's what they'd waited for him to claim. And tomorrow, with a stranger's help or without it, Michael would begin the work of making that inheritance mean something, of turning sacrifice into justice, of transforming grief into purpose, of finishing what his grandfather started. Outside, the Montana night was vast and dark and full of stars that had watched this land for longer than humans had walked it. The wind moved through the grass. The ranch house settled on its foundation with the creaks and groans of old wood remembering what it used to be. And somewhere in that darkness, the truth about 23 murdered people waited to be uncovered. Michael Brennan was ready to dig. Frank Dalton arrived at 9 a.m. exactly, driving a Dodge Ram that had seen better decades but still ran clean. The kind of truck a man maintains because maintenance is ritual, and ritual keeps chaos at bay. He parked beside Michael's Ford without hesitation, like he'd been here before. Like he knew this land. Like coming to Thunder Ridge Ranch wasn't crossing a threshold, but coming home to a place that had haunted him for 27 years. Michael watched from the porch. Lily stood beside him, small hand wrapped around two of his fingers. The morning was cool, Montana spring still deciding whether to commit to warmth or retreat into winter one more time. Frost glittered on the grass and shadows the sun hadn't reached yet. The mountains in the distance wore snow. Like old men wore regret, something they couldn't shake no matter how hard they tried. The man who emerged from the truck moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect, incompetent to demand it. Late 60s, gray hair military short, face weathered by Montana winters and something harder than weather. He wore work clothes that had actually worked, Carhartt jackets scarred by years of use, boots that knew what dirt felt like. His eyes found Michael's and held them. No flinching, no apology, just acknowledgement that they were both here for reasons that went deeper than coffee and conversation. He walked toward the porch carrying two thermoses and the weight of whatever he'd come to confess. Michael Brennan? That's me. Frank Dalton. The man extended his hand. The grip was firm, calloused. The handshake of someone who'd built things and broken things and knew the difference. Lily tugged Michael's jacket. Her whisper was loud enough to hear. Is he a cowboy? Frank's mouth quirked. First hint of warmth in a face built for harder expressions. Used to be something like that, kid. Marine, actually, long time ago. Did you know my great-grandpa? The warmth died, replaced by something that looked like pain wrapped in old scar tissue. Yeah, I did. He was one hell of a man. They sat on the porch. 3 people and 2 thermoses, and the ghost of William Harper between them, like a fourth presence demanding acknowledgement. Frank poured coffee into tin cups he'd brought. The coffee was good, strong, the kind that said the man who made it understood mornings were battles and you needed proper weapons. Lily went inside to color after Frank gave her a knowing look that said he needed to talk to her daddy about grown-up things. She understood. Kids always understood more than adults gave them credit for. She left without complaint, but Michael saw her position herself near the window where she could watch. Protecting, always protecting. Frank stared at his coffee for a long moment before speaking. I was the FBI agent assigned to Williams' case in '98. He had evidence. Good evidence. Documentation of pattern disappearances over 3 decades. Cross-references to construction projects, shell companies, political connections. I believed him. Then why didn't you help him? The question hung there. Direct, demanding. Michael had learned not to dance around hard things. Life was too short and too brutal for politeness. Frank's pause was the pause of a man choosing between comfortable lies and painful truth. I tried, took it to my superior. He took it to his superior. Week later, I get called in, investigations being shut down. Federal interest, orders from D.C. I pushed back, said we had probable cause, said we had witnesses willing to testify, said innocent people were dying and we had a duty to act. He stopped, drank coffee. The silence stretched long enough that Michael thought maybe that was the end of it. Then Frank continued, and his voice had changed, had gone somewhere darker. 2 days later, my wife Margaret was driving home from work. Brake failure on a mountain road. SUV went off a cliff. She was killed instantly. That's what the investigators said. Mechanical defect, random tragedy, bad luck. Michael felt his chest tighten. But Margaret had gotten the brake service 3 days before. I had the receipt, and there was a car following her that witnesses saw. Black sedan, no plates. It stayed behind her for 5 miles, right up until the cliff. Then it disappeared. They killed your wife. Frank's eyes met his. In them, Michael saw everything. The knowing, the guilt, the rage that had nowhere to go, the grief that had calcified into something harder. I could never prove it, but I knew. William knew. That's when I made my choice. He set down his coffee cup, looked at his hands. Old hands, capable hands. Hands that had failed when they needed to hold firm. I backed off, took early retirement, let William fight alone. He lost his grandson. I lost my wife. And I lived. That's the coward's math. He stood up and they took everything from him. I sat down and they let me breathe. 27 years of breathing when better men suffocated. The confessions settled between them like dust. Michael understood shame, understood the weight of choices made from fear, understood living with consequences that followed you into every mirror. Why are you here now? Because I won't fail William's family twice. Because you're here with your daughter trying to do right by your grandfather's memory. And because I'm 68 years old with no wife, no kids, no reason to keep breathing except I'm too stubborn to stop. The honesty was brutal, clean. The kind of truth men only spoke when they'd run out of reasons to lie to themselves. Also, Frank continued, because taking down corrupt politicians is every old agent's dream retirement project. And I'm bored as hell. That got a small laugh from Michael. Unexpected. Welcome. The tension cracked just enough to let air in. What do you have? Copies. Everything William documented I kept. Against orders, against common sense. For 27 years I've been sitting on evidence in a storage unit, telling myself someday I'd do something with it. Someday I'd find the courage William had. Someday I'd make Margaret's death mean something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thumb drive. This is digitized. Every notebook, every photograph, every piece of evidence William collected before they took you away. I've spent 27 years organizing it, cross-referencing it, building what he started. I know the names, know the timeline, know the method they used. What method? Frank's expression went grim. They buried them in construction projects. Excavations for highways, bridges, foundations. Kill someone, dump the body in a hole that's about to be filled with concrete or asphalt. Evidence sealed under infrastructure. You'd have to tear up half of Montana to recover remains. The implications spread through Michael's mind like cracks in ice. How many? William identified 23. I found evidence of 7 more from the 60s and 70s, before your grandfather started watching. Total might be 30 or more over 40 years. Jesus Christ, Frank nodded, sipped coffee, gave Michael time to process numbers that shouldn't be possible in rural Montana. Numbers that spoke to organization, planning, power. Who's behind it? Senator Richard Blackwell. Same man trying to buy this ranch. He's been Montana's golden boy for 40 years. Economic development, infrastructure projects, jobs and growth and progress. Started as junior state senator in '85. Worked his way up. Now he's Senate Majority Leader, running for governor. Probably win unless someone stops him. And the victims? Mostly young people, 18 to 25. Drifters, college kids, indigenous people from reservations. People the system doesn't look for too hard when they disappear. Blackwell's crews made them into fill material. The cold calculation of it, the selection of victims who wouldn't be missed, the weaponization of society's indifference. It was evil wearing a suit and calling itself progress. We need federal prosecution, Frank said. Can't go through Montana. Totally compromised. Sheriffs on the payroll, judges too. State police look the other way. We need someone outside the state with resources and authority. You have someone in mind? Catherine Hayes, Assistant U.S. Attorney in Portland, Oregon office. Clean record. Won cases against officials who thought themselves untouchable. She was a junior prosecutor when I retired. Now she's senior, respected, feared. If anyone can make this stick, it's her. How fast can we move? Frank considered the question. Drank more coffee. The answer mattered. Speed meant risk. Delay meant more time for Blackwell to destroy evidence or eliminate threats. 4 to 6 weeks minimum. We need to make this airtight. Organize evidence, FBI standard. Identify witnesses. Build timeline that survives challenge. Contact families of victims who might testify. Get your grandfather's documentation verified by independent sources. Then we approach Kate with a package she can't ignore and a case she can't lose. Michael looked at the ranch, at the house that needed repair, at the barn with its collapsed corner, at the land stretching away in every direction. While we build the case, we rebuild this place. Make it look like I'm just a broke carpenter trying to salvage an inheritance. Give Blackwell no reason to think I found William's evidence. Frank's smile was wolf-thin. Make ourselves look harmless while we sharpen knives. I like it. I've got connections for supplies, salvage from completed projects. I can teach you what William would have taught you if they'd let him. Michael extended his hand. Frank shook it. The grip was different this time. Not introduction. Alliance. Two men with nothing to lose and everything to prove making a pact on a porch where an old rancher once sat and built a case that would wait 27 years to matter. Lily appeared in the doorway. She'd been listening. Of course she'd been listening. 8-year-olds were surveillance experts. Mr. Frank, are you going to help us? Yeah, kid, I am. Are you lonely? The question landed like an arrow in soft flesh. Frank's expression cracked. Just for a second, just enough to see the wound underneath. Ain't so much anymore. They spent the afternoon in William's war room, Frank seeing it for the first time, Michael watching the old agent's face as he absorbed what William Harper had built in isolation. The maps, the pins, the photographs, the red yarn connecting conspiracy threads across decades. This is better than 90% of FBI cases I worked, Frank said quietly. William went deep. Obsessive, careful, brilliant. He had everything except the final piece. The why, the method, the burial locations. Michael showed him the construction records he'd pulled from public databases. The pattern matching disappearances to completed projects 60 to 90 days later. He didn't have these tools, Michael said. Internet, digital records, cross-reference databases. I found in 3 hours what he couldn't find in 10 years. Frank studied the spreadsheet, his jaw set. The muscle jumping there spoke to anger held tight. With this plus everything he documented, we can prosecute. But we do it right, no rushing, no mistakes. Blackwell's had 40 years to build defenses. We get one shot. They worked until sunset, organizing, digitizing, building file structures, creating timeline documents, witness lists, evidence chains. Frank's FBI training shaped raw information into prosecution-ready structure. Michael's carpenter precision ensured every detail fit square and level. Lily helped where she could, fetching files, organizing by date, learning the names, learning the faces. At one point, she asked Frank about the woman in the photograph, labeled Angela Chen, 21, missing 2004. Who was she? Someone's daughter, someone's cousin, someone who wanted to be a nurse. She disappeared walking home from class, never made it. Family's been looking for 16 years. Did great-grandpa Bill know her? No, but he made it his business to learn about every single person on these walls. That's why it broke him. Lily was quiet for a long time after that. When she spoke again, her voice was small. We're going to help find her, right? Frank knelt to her level, looked her in the eyes with the seriousness she deserved. Yeah, kid, that's exactly what we're going to do. The next morning, they began the physical work. Frank arrived at dawn with his truck bed full of salvaged lumber, bundles of shingles, windows wrapped in blankets, tools that had seen decades of use and still held edges. The kind of equipment a man accumulates over a lifetime of building and maintains because tools were investments and investments were sacred. They started with the roof, the most urgent need. Water was the enemy. Let water in, and everything else accelerated toward collapse. Michael had framed houses for 15 years, knew roof lines and load-bearing walls, and how to make structures weather-tight. But Frank had something else, intuition. The kind of knowledge that came from building in Montana, where winter tested every joint and summer baked every nail. You measure twice because once isn't enough, Frank said, and you cut once because wood doesn't grow back. Simple wisdom, the kind William would have taught if given the chance. Michael felt the absence like a phantom limb. This should have been his grandfather on this roof. Should have been William's hands guiding his. Should have been family passing knowledge through generations the way it was supposed to happen. But family was where you found it. Frank teaching him load distribution and proper nail patterns was family, was legacy, was the universe trying to stitch torn things back together. Lily worked at ground level, fetching tools, organizing materials, learning measurements through practical application. Frank was patient with her, explained things simply but never talked down, showed her how to hold a hammer, how to read a tape measure, how buildings spoke if you learned their language. You've got good hands, kid, Frank told her as she carefully sorted nails by size. Gentle but strong. Those are rare. Like Daddy's hands, just like Daddy's hands. The work was hard, hot, endless. Montana's sun bore down without mercy. Michael's shoulders burned, his back ached, hands blistered despite gloves. But there was something cleansing about it. Physical labor that produced visible results. A roof that went from broken to whole. A house that went from dying to recovering. Progress you could measure in square feet and sweat. They worked until the light failed, then worked some more by utility lights Frank had brought. By the end of the first week, half the roof wore new shingles. The northwest corner was reinforced. No more gaps where rain could enter. No more slow rot eating the house from above. Evenings belonged to evidence. They'd clean up, eat simple meals, then return to the war room. Michael reading William's journals while Frank organized digital files, building databases, creating exhibits, preparing the case that would eventually land on Catherine Hayes' desk with the weight of 30 years behind it. Frank had made contact with 3 potential witnesses. Former Blackwell development employees who'd seen things, who'd been paid to forget, who might testify if offered protection. Doug Carver, Frank said, reading from his notes. 64, retired equipment operator, worked for Blackwell in the 90s. Says he dug deeper than blueprints specified on multiple projects. Says sealed containers went into excavations before concrete poured. Never asked what was in them, got paid extra not to. Will he testify? Maybe. If we can guarantee witness protection. He's scared. They sent someone to his house last month, asked about his health, about his grandkids. Implied things would be unfortunate if he started talking about old jobs. The threat was clear. The method was elegant. No violence, no explicit intimidation, just the suggestion that cooperation had costs and silence had benefits. Maria Crawford, Frank continued, 58, former site manager. She was there the night Blackwell himself visited a construction site. Says he emerged from a private trailer looking shaken. She was offered $5,000 to forget whatever she hadn't seen. Took the money, has regretted it for 20 years. And the third, Kenny Wilson, 71, retired foreman. He's gone silent. Agreed to preliminary conversations, then stopped answering calls. My contacts say black SUVs were parked outside his Billings apartment for 3 nights straight. Message received. They're activating, Michael said. They know something's happening. They know you claimed the inheritance and didn't immediately sell. That makes you a question mark. Question marks make powerful people nervous. The tire tracks appeared on day 12. Michael found them near the property line while hauling debris. Fresh impressions in soft earth where vehicles had no reason to be. The pattern suggested someone had driven from the old access road, circled the house at distance, then returned. Recent enough that weather hadn't eroded the marks. Professional enough to stay outside camera range. They would have expected if they'd thought Michael was smart enough to install cameras. Frank studied the tracks with an expression Michael had learned meant concern masked as analysis. Expected this. When you claimed the inheritance, they noticed. Now they're assessing whether you're a threat or just another broke carpenter trying to salvage property. We need security before they decide you're the former. The camera system went up that afternoon. 6 units covering approaches. Motion activated. Wireless link to a laptop monitoring station Frank configured in the study. Perimeter sensors covered gaps. Trip alarms at key points. The ranch became fortress in waiting while maintaining appearance of renovation project. They kept working visible exterior repairs during daylight. New siding on the south wall where rot had penetrated deepest. The porch gaining railings that didn't wobble under weight. Windows throughout the house transitioning from boarded darkness to actual glass, letting Montana sunlight flood rooms that had existed in perpetual twilight. Lily claimed her old room as Michael's had been, covering walls with drawings that showed the house in progressive states of repair. Broken to fixing to fixed. Rendered in crayon optimism that made grown men's throats tight when they looked too long. On day 17, a different vehicle arrived. Not surveillance, not threat assessment. A Subaru Outback with out-of-state plates and equipment in the back that screamed journalist. The woman who emerged was mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back, eyes that missed nothing. Camera bag over shoulder. The look of someone who'd spent years learning to see what others overlooked. She approached the porch where Michael and Frank were taking a water break. Michael Brennan? I'm Elena Morrison, investigative journalist. I've been tracking Blackwell development for 3 years. When your grandfather's ranch changed hands, it pinged my alerts. Can we talk? Michael and Frank exchanged glances. Journalists were complications. Could help, could hurt, could expose everything before they were ready. What's your interest in Blackwell? Elena's expression went hard. Same as yours, I suspect. Justice, accountability, making sure powerful people face consequences. I've documented 8 disappearances connected to Blackwell's projects. I've traced shell companies, political donations, influence buying, but I lack physical evidence and witnesses. You have what I need. I have resources you might find useful. Why should we trust you? You shouldn't, but I'll tell you something that might change that calculation. My sister Sarah disappeared in '98, 19 years old, Missoula, Montana. Police said runaway. I never believed it. I became a journalist to find her. Spent 16 years investigating. Her case doesn't match the pattern perfectly. Different timeline, different location, but close enough that I need to know. The personal stake, the obsession born from loss. Michael understood that, was living that. Frank had lived it for 27 years. They brought her into the war room, watched her face as she absorbed what William Harper had spent a decade building, saw the moment she understood the scope, the organization, the careful documentation of conspiracy that had operated for 40 years. This is remarkable, she said quietly. Your grandfather was either brilliant or paranoid. Turns out he was both. She showed them her own files, digital archives, newspaper clippings from across Montana, missing person reports, construction permits, financial records, 7 additional names from the 60s and 70s. Before William started watching, people who'd vanished near Blackwell projects and been forgotten. Robert Chen, 1967, Patricia Voss, 1971, James Running Bear, 1973, Angela Herrera, 1976, 3 others she hadn't been able to identify yet. With your grandfather's documentation and my research, Elena said, we might have the complete list. 30-plus victims over 40 years. That's not just murder. That's industrial-scale conspiracy. Frank was skeptical. Journalists could be bought, could be compromised, could promise discretion and deliver exposure at the worst possible moment. But Michael saw something in Elena Morrison's eyes, the same thing he saw in his own mirror. The weight of the missing, the responsibility to the dead, the refusal to let powerful people erase inconvenient truths. Partner with us, Michael said. When this breaks, you get exclusive. In exchange, you help us dig deeper, you share your resources, and you wait until we're ready to go public. No stories, no leaks, no giving Blackwell warning. Elena extended her hand. Deal! They worked together for the next week. 3 people in a war room built by a 4th. Connecting threads, building timeline, identifying patterns. Elena's journalistic training complemented Frank's FBI methodology. She knew how to find information in public records, how to interview without alerting subjects, how to build narrative that made complex conspiracy comprehensible. She brought files on victim families, personal effects, photographs, letters, making the yellow pins into people with lives and dreams and futures that had been stolen. Michael found himself looking at a photo of Angela Chen, 21, nursing student, disappeared walking home from class in 2004. Her mother had kept her room unchanged for 16 years, waiting, hoping, dying slowly from not knowing. These aren't abstractions, Elena said, watching him study the photograph. These are daughters, sons, someone's best friend, someone's first love. Blackwell didn't just kill them, he erased them, made them disappear so thoroughly that even the people who loved them started doubting their own memories. Lily was listening from where she sat organizing files. She'd become part of the operation, too young to fully understand but old enough to know it mattered. She looked at Angela's photo for a long time. Great-Grandpa Bill knew all these people. Some of them knew. He made it his business to learn about every single one. That's why it broke him. You can't know 30 people who were murdered and stay whole. The knowing changes you. The surveillance intensified on day 22. Motion sensors logged vehicles on the access road at predictable intervals. Dawn, noon, dusk, professional patterns, someone tracking their routines. Cataloging when they worked outside versus inside. Noting Frank's truck arrivals and departures. The cameras Frank installed captured distant shapes too far for identification, but close enough to confirm Michael's growing certainty that powerful people were deciding how to handle the problem of William Harper's grandson. Then on day 28, the decision arrived in person. Andrew Sterling emerged from an expensive SUV, wearing business casual that screamed money and influence. 50-something, confident stride, smile that never touched his eyes. He approached the porch where Michael was pressure washing boards Frank had replaced, Lily supposedly napping inside, but actually building a fort from couch cushions. Mr. Brennan, I represent Senator Blackwell and Blackwell Development Group. I'm glad you're still here. Shows character, determination. The senator admires that. He opened a briefcase. Inside, papers and what looked like a cashier's check, which is why he's authorized me to make a revised offer. $5 million, no questions, no contingencies. You sign over the property. We handle all transfer costs. You and your daughter start over anywhere you want with enough money to make that fresh start count. The number hit like physical impact. $5 million, enough to never worry about money again. College fund for Lily. Security for decades. Everything the divorce and unemployment had stolen returned with interest that could buy any life they wanted. But Michael had spent 28 days reading his grandfather's pain, organizing evidence of 30 murdered people, watching his daughter learn to trust that home meant something permanent. The number was large because the desperation behind it was larger. Not interested. Sterling's smile never wavered. Mr. Brennan, be reasonable. $5 million. You're living in a half-renovated house with $800 in your account. Yes, we checked. Raising a daughter who deserves better than this. The senator is being generous because he respects your grandfather's memory, wants to end this amicably. But this offer expires in 48 hours. After that, things become less friendly. Lily appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices. Sterling's attention shifted to her with calculation that made Michael's hands curl into fists. Think about her future. About what kind of father prioritizes stubborn pride over his daughter's security and safety. The words triggered something primal. Michael closed the distance between them in 2 steps, grabbed Sterling by his expensive jacket, slammed him against the SUV hard enough to dent metal. Don't you dare talk about my daughter. Don't you dare pretend this is about her safety when your boss has been murdering people and burying them under highways for 40 years. We found the pattern. We have witnesses. We have evidence. And in days, a federal prosecutor sees everything. Sterling didn't struggle, but his expression shifted from performance to genuine threat. You just made a serious mistake. The senator tried being reasonable, tried giving you a way out. But if you're choosing war, understand what that means. We have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach everywhere. Your grandfather learned that lesson. I'd hoped you were smarter. Michael released him, stepped back, hands shaking with adrenaline. Get off my property. Tell your senator his money doesn't buy silence this time. Tell him his days of hiding behind power are ending. Sterling straightened his jacket with deliberate care, retrieved his briefcase, climbed into his SUV without rush. 48 hours, Mr. Brennan. After that, consequences are on you. He drove away slowly, tires crunching gravel, leaving silence that felt like the space between lightning and thunder. Frank had witnessed the entire exchange from the porch, phone in hand, recording everything. That's assault on video. He can use it. Let him try. Michael found Lily still standing in the doorway, pulled her into his arms, felt her small heartbeat against his chest. You scared him, didn't you, Daddy? Sometimes standing up to bullies looks scary, but it's necessary, you understand that? She nodded against his shoulder. Like in your cowboy movies. The good guys don't run from bad guys. Exactly like that, baby. Exactly like that. That evening brought messages from Frank's contacts. 2 more potential witnesses had gone silent. One moved out of state overnight. Another claimed sudden memory problems regarding his employment at Blackwell Development. The intimidation campaign was accelerating, resources deploying to contain the threat before Michael could make it official. Kenny Wilson finally called on day 29, his voice gravelly with age and resignation. I can't testify. They visited my daughter in Denver, mentioned her kids, how unfortunate accidents happen when people make wrong choices. I'm 71 years old. I did things I'm not proud of because I needed work, but I can't risk my grandchildren. I'm sorry. Frank's response came gentle. Kenny, I understand. Family comes first. But know this, what you saw, what you know, it matters. If you change your mind, If you change your mind, we'll protect you. Federal witness protection, relocation, new identities if necessary. Think about it. After the call disconnected, Frank sat silent for long minutes. This is what evil looks like in practice. Not monsters, not cartoon villains, just people making calculations, choosing safety over conscience, protecting theirs at the cost of everyone else's. William fought that for 10 years and lost. We might lose too, but at least we're fighting. Michael's laptop pinged with encrypted email. Kate Hayes responding to Frank's preliminary case summary with 3 words that changed everything. Warrants approved. Excavation authorized. Frank read the full message aloud. Federal authorization granted for forensic excavation at 3 construction sites based on preliminary evidence review. Ground penetrating radar scheduled. Excavation teams on standby. Process begins in 10 days. Need both of you safe until evidence secured and indictments prepared. Recommend immediate protective custody. 10 days. In 10 days, highways and bridges and foundations would be torn open. Bodies would be recovered. DNA would confirm identities. And Senator Richard Blackwell's carefully constructed empire would begin collapsing under the weight of truth it had buried for 40 years. Michael's phone buzzed, number unlisted, voicemail arriving without ring. Mr. Brennan, this is your final warning. Walk away, take your daughter, and disappear. Because what happens next, you brought on yourself. The threat was clear. Timeline obvious. They knew about the excavation warrants or suspected them. Knew they had days to eliminate the problem before evidence became irrefutable. Frank recognized the same calculus. They'll move soon, tonight, tomorrow night. Can't wait for official action. We need to prepare defenses or evacuate now. Evacuate meant leaving the ranch undefended, possibly torched, certainly destroyed. Defend meant risking Lily in a confrontation that could turn violent. The choice was impossible until Lily herself made it simple, her voice carrying from her bedroom where she was supposed to be sleeping. Are we leaving? Michael went to her, found her sitting up in bed, stuffed bear clutched tight, eyes too old for 8 years. What did you hear, baby? Enough! She climbed out of bed, walked to the doorway, small shape silhouetted by nightlight glow. This is our home. Great-Grandpa Bill wanted us here. I don't want to run. Frank started to object, but Michael raised a hand. If we defend, what does that look like? Frank's military training showed in his assessment. Secure the house. Establish fallback positions. Arm ourselves, monitor approaches, call law enforcement at first contact. Odds aren't great, but we make it costly enough they reconsider. Michael looked at his daughter, at the home they'd rebuilt through sweat and determination, at 30 yellow pins marking faces that deserve justice. We defend, but Lily evacuates at first sign of trouble. Non-negotiable. Frank nodded. I'll make preparations. The night passed in tense vigilance. Frank's tactical experience transformed the ranch into defensible position. Motion sensors expanded. Cameras repositioned for maximum coverage. Firearms cleaned and loaded. Ammunition inventoried. Escape routes mapped and rehearsed. He showed Michael how to hold the rifle properly. Sight picture. Trigger squeeze. Treating every shot like it might be the one that mattered. The lesson felt surreal. 3 weeks ago, Michael had been living in his truck, applying for construction jobs, trying to keep his daughter fed. Now he was learning combat marksmanship to defend a home against people willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Lily spent the day helping Frank organize emergency supplies. Backpacks with food, water, first aid, cash, copies of critical documents. She approached the preparations with 8-year-old seriousness that suggested she understood more than they'd told her. When Frank explained the tunnel William had built beneath the barn, old storm shelter expanded into escape route, she insisted on practicing the evacuation twice until she could navigate it without help. They waited, watched, prepared. The ranch stood quiet under Montana stars. Inside, 3 people who'd become family through choice rather than blood kept vigil over evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. Michael stood on the porch as midnight approached. The same porch where William Harper had sat and built a case, where Margaret had waited for a grandson who wouldn't return for 27 years, where Michael now stood ready to defend what they'd preserved. Frank joined him. 2 men, coffee instead of whiskey, stars overhead that had watched this land longer than humans had walked it. You know they're coming. Yeah. You know we might not win. Yeah. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke words Michael suspected he'd been carrying for 2 decades. Margaret used to say that living without purpose is just waiting to die. I've been waiting 27 years. Tonight, if they come, at least I'll be fighting for something that matters. That's more than I've had since they killed her. Michael understood perfectly. They were both men who'd lost too much, who'd been broken by circumstances and choices and forces larger than themselves. Who'd found in this ranch and this fight something worth the cost of standing, worth dying for, if it came to that. The motion sensors triggered at 2:17 a.m. Multiple contacts, coordinated approach from 3 directions. Laptop screens showed thermal signatures converging on the house. 6 figures in tactical formation that spoke of military training and serious intent. Frank's voice came urgent and controlled. Wake Lily. Grab the go bags. Move to the tunnel. I'll hold them here. Buy time. Michael was already moving. The plan they'd rehearsed. The escape they'd prepared. He scooped Lily from sleep, wrapped her in the blanket she'd been clutching. Come on, baby. Remember the drill. We're going to the barn now, just like we practiced. Her arms circled his neck, voice muzzy with interrupted dreams. The bad men came. Yeah, baby, but we're ready. You're safe. I promise. Behind them, glass shattered. Front windows breaking as entry began. Frank's rifle spoke once. Twice. Sharp cracks that echoed across grassland and sent adrenaline spiking through Michael's bloodstream. They ran across open ground toward the barn. Lily, a solid weight against his chest. Go bag heavy on his back. More shots behind them. Different calibers. Someone shouting orders. Frank was outnumbered but using defensive position effectively, making attackers pay for every approach. The barn's false floor panel lifted easily. Revealing tunnel entrance, William had excavated decades ago with paranoia that now seemed justified. Ladder descended 15 feet to packed earth passage. Emergency lights casting weak illumination. Lily climbed down first, nimble and quick. Michael followed, pulled the panel closed above. Started crawling. The tunnel stretched 200 yards, barely wide enough for shoulders, rough-hewn walls showing marks of William's shovel work. They emerged into wilderness, air cold and clean, stars overhead seeming to spin. Behind them, muzzle flashes visible at the house. Frank still fighting, still buying them time, still making good on promises to a dead man in a living cause. Frank's truck sat where he'd positioned it that morning, keys under the driver's mat. Michael strapped Lily into the back seat, started the engine, lights off, transmission in gear. He waited, every second an eternity, hoping Frank would appear, knowing he might not, knowing the old Marine might have decided this was where he made his stand, where he paid the debt he'd carried for 27 years. Movement in the trees, Frank running hard, rifle slung across his back, limping but fast. Michael restarted the engine, popped the door. Frank dove into the passenger seat, bleeding from his shoulder, face grim. Drive north, don't stop for anything. The truck launched forward, tires finding purchase on forest floor, bouncing over terrain that threatened to shake them apart. Shots cracked behind them, muzzle flashes in the darkness, bullets punching through tailgate but missing occupants. Michael drove by instinct, no headlights. Using starlight and memory of terrain Frank had made him memorize. The truck crashed through brush, splashed across shallow creek, emerged onto access road doing 40 miles per hour. Lily's voice came small from the back seat. Daddy, why are people shooting at us? Because we found out bad things they did and they're scared we'll tell. But we're safe now, baby. We're going somewhere they can't follow. Frank pressed, hand against his shoulder, blood seeping between fingers. Graze, clean through. I'm fine. Keep driving. The headlights came on once they hit highway. Civilization resuming around them like surfacing from deep water. Michael pushed the truck to 80, watching mirrors for pursuit that never materialized. They'd committed attempted murder of federal witnesses, but following meant confirming involvement, leaving witnesses alive to identify them. Better to retreat, destroy evidence of their presence. Hope Michael and Frank couldn't prove what had happened. The drive to Portland took 9 hours through mountain darkness in high desert dawn, stopping once for wine and first aid supplies at a 24-hour truck stop. Frank cleaned his wound in a bathroom that smelled of diesel and desperation. Emerged with shoulder bandaged and color returning to his face. Lily slept in the back seat, wrapped in emergency blankets, exhausted beyond fear, trusting her father to deliver on promises of safety. They reached Portland as a morning rush hour began. City noise and traffic, feeling alien after weeks of Montana isolation. Frank directed them to a secure apartment, safe house owned by former colleague, empty space that served agents who needed to disappear. The address didn't exist in public records. The building superintendent had been FBI before retirement. The windows were bulletproof, the door reinforced, the phone lines encrypted. Michael carried Lily inside, found a bedroom, tucked her into bed despite the morning hour. Rest. When you wake up, we'll get breakfast, and I'll explain everything. She was asleep before he finished the sentence. Frank made coffee in the sterile kitchen, hands shaking slightly from blood loss and adrenaline crash. Called Kate from the truck while you were watching the road. She's meeting us this afternoon. Federal marshals are securing the ranch. What's left of it? Collecting evidence. They found shell casings. Blood, signs of forced entry, combined with our testimony and security footage. That's attempted murder of federal witnesses. That adds to the charges. Michael thought about the house, about Lily's drawings on the walls, about the rocker Margaret had loved, about William's study with 30 yellow pins marking lives taken. What about the house? Frank's silence was answer enough. Some things can be rebuilt. Some things matter more than structures. Michael nodded. Understood. The ranch had been home for 4 weeks, had been waiting for 27 years. Now it was a crime scene. Evidence of conspiracy's desperation. Proof that truth threatened people willing to burn it all down rather than face accountability. The meeting with Catherine Hayes happened at 3 p.m. in a conference room at the federal building. Windows overlooking the Willamette River. Security so tight they'd pass through 3 checkpoints and a metal detector. Kate herself matched Frank's description. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, wearing exhaustion like a badge from cases that never slept. She listened to their account without interruption, taking notes, occasionally asking questions that showed prosecutorial mind assembling narrative into evidence structure. When they finished, she slid a folder across the table. Excavation began this morning at Highway 89 site. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies consistent with human remains. Dig crews found 3 bodies in the first 4 hours, all showing signs of trauma, all buried in excavation fill before asphalt was poured. Forensics is processing for DNA, but preliminary work suggests these are Jenny Martinez, Kyle Thompson, and Sarah Winters. 3 of the 23 your grandfather identified. The words hit Michael with unexpected force. William had been right. Every supposition, every connection, every terrible conclusion. Right. The validation came decades late, but it came. With bodies recovered and your testimony, Kate continued, we have grounds for immediate arrests. Senator Blackwell, Sheriff Tucker, Judge Crawford, Andrew Sterling, 15 others named in your evidence. Federal marshals are preparing coordinated raids across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Execution set for dawn tomorrow. By the time breakfast news airs, Montana's political landscape will have changed permanently. Frank leaned forward. Witness protection for Michael and Lily. Already arranged. New identities, relocation, financial support until trials conclude. You have my word. Kate looked at Michael directly. Your grandfather spent a decade building this case. You spent 4 weeks finishing what he started. 23 families are getting answers they waited years to receive. That's worth something, and that's worth everything. The hotel room that night felt simultaneously secure and temporary. Federal protection, guards outside, Lily sleeping in the next bed. Tomorrow the arrests would happen. Tomorrow the world would learn what Senator Richard Blackwell had done. Tomorrow started the long process of trials and testimony and justice delivered through legal mechanisms that William Harper had trusted would eventually function if given enough truth to work with. Michael stood at the window, watching Portland lights spread toward distant darkness. Somewhere in Montana, a ranch house stood damaged but not destroyed, evidence of attack proving conspiracy's willingness to murder. Somewhere in courtrooms and jails, powerful people would learn that authority ended where accountability began. Somewhere in the dark, 30 families were about to receive phone calls explaining that their missing loved ones had been found. That answers existed after years of silence, that someone had cared enough to look. Frank sat in the apartment's living room, shoulder bandaged, rifle cleaned and ready despite being in federal custody. The old FBI agent had carried guilt for 27 years. Tomorrow that debt would begin resolving into something that looked like justice. Michael closed his eyes, saw William's study, walls covered in evidence, yellow pins marking faces that deserved remembering. Tomorrow those faces would have names again. Tomorrow their families would grieve properly. Finally, completely. Tomorrow a senator would learn that 30 years of silence could end in a single day when truth found the right people at the right moment. Some debts could only be paid in courage and time. William Harper had given both. His grandson had added determination and the willingness to risk everything. And together across 27 years and 400 miles, they'd built something that mattered more than safety or comfort or the tempting escape of $5 million. Justice delivered late, but delivered complete. The way it was always supposed to work when the system functioned as designed. The city lights blurred as exhaustion claimed Michael completely. Tomorrow would bring arrests, news coverage, the beginning of legal processes that would stretch for months. But tonight his daughter slept safe and his grandfather's evidence had finally reached people with authority to act. Thunder Ridge Ranch waited in Montana darkness, damaged but standing. Home to ghosts who could finally rest knowing their sacrifice had mattered. The fight wasn't finished. Trials remained. Testimony waited. Justice would demand patience and persistence. But the war's first battle had been won through determination, evidence, and the simple refusal to accept that power equaled immunity from consequence. Michael Brennan had inherited more than land. He'd inherited a fight. And with Frank Dalton's help and Catherine Hayes' authority and the ghosts of 30 murdered people demanding remembrance, he was going to finish what his grandfather started. No matter no matter how long it took, no matter who stood in the way. The inheritance was not the ranch. The inheritance was the fight. And Michael Brennan was ready for war. The dawn raids happened with surgical precision across 3 states simultaneously. Federal marshals executing warrants with coordination that left no room for escape or evidence destruction. Catherine Hayes had planned every detail, timed every action, ensured that when the hammer fell, it fell everywhere at once. Senator Richard Blackwell was arrested at his Helena mansion while eating breakfast. Still wearing silk pajamas when they handcuffed him in front of news cameras, his own communications director had summoned for a campaign photo opportunity. The irony was too perfect to be accidental. Kate had timed the operation to maximize humiliation, understanding that public shame served justice better than private custody. Michael watched it on television from the Portland safe house, Lily beside him on the couch, Frank in the chair with his bandaged shoulder. Coffee growing cold as they absorbed images that felt surreal. A United States Senator, face of Montana development, champion of infrastructure and jobs, being read his rights while reporters shouted questions and neighbors emerged from expensive homes to witness the fall. Sheriff Raymond Tucker went down at his office, surrounded by deputies who watched their boss being perp-walked with expressions ranging from shock to vindication. Some had suspected, most had looked away. All now understood that complicity had limits and federal authority didn't respect local loyalties when crimes crossed state lines and body counts reached 30. Judge Helen Crawford fought the arrest with legal objections that crumbled under the weight of evidence. Her courtroom, where she dismissed cases and protected conspirators for decades, became the staging area for her own perp walk. Bailiffs she'd worked with for years avoiding eye contact as marshals led her out in handcuffs. Andrew Sterling tried running, made it to Bozeman Airport before being tackled by agents who tracked his movements since the ranch attack. His expensive suit tore during the takedown, blood from a split lip staining his collar. The indignity complete when local news crews broadcast footage of Montana's most connected fixer face down on airport concrete. 15 others followed in coordinated sweeps. Construction company executives, shell company officers, land development managers. The apparatus that had made murder profitable for 40 years. The arrests dominated morning news cycles. Cable networks interrupting programming for live coverage. Anchors struggling to convey the scope of conspiracy that had operated in plain sight while law enforcement looked the other way or actively participated. The excavation results arrived in stages over the following week. Each new discovery, another nail in coffins already sealed. Highway 89 yielded 5 bodies instead of 3, construction having layered victims over multiple years. The Clearwater Bridge site revealed 4 more. Concrete jackhammers exposing remains that forensics carefully extracted and photographed with the reverence owed to the dead, too long forgotten. A shopping center foundation gave up 3 victims who'd been missing since the 90s. their families having spent decades believing they'd run away to cities and new lives. DNA identification took longer, but eventually matched all 12 recovered bodies to names from Williams' list. Jenny Martinez, Kyle Thompson, Sarah Winters, Michael Chen, Patricia Blackwood, James Running Bear, Angela Herrera, David Moss, Kimberly Foster, Raymond Tall Elk, Crystal Winters, Thomas Lee. Young people, 18 to 25, each with families who'd never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping against hope that someday they'd get answers. The phone calls to those families happened over 2 terrible days, federal agents delivering news that brought simultaneous grief and relief. Patricia Blackwood's mother collapsed hearing her daughter had been found, had been murdered, would finally receive proper burial after 15 years of unknowing. James Running Bear's father, a tribal elder who'd fought for investigation into his son's disappearance, wept on camera when told that evidence would finally bring prosecution and his boy could rest according to traditional ceremonies. The media coverage shifted from sensational arrest to human tragedy. Networks running profiles of victims that transformed them from statistics into people with dreams and families and futures that had been stolen. Michael watched one profile, Angela Herrera, 19, aspiring veterinarian who disappeared walking home from her job at a Billings animal clinic. Lily sat beside him, absorbing images of a young woman who looked happy in every photograph, who'd had plans, who'd wanted to help animals, who'd never gotten the chance. Why would anyone hurt her? She just wanted to help animals. Because some people care more about money and power than human life, baby. Because they thought they could get away with it. But they couldn't. Great-Grandpa Bill made sure of that. Elena Morrison's exclusive coverage ran across multiple platforms. Her 3 years of investigation combined with Williams' evidence created comprehensive narrative that made the conspiracy comprehensible. She'd written it carefully, focusing on victims, honoring families, making Blackwell's crimes personal rather than abstract, making readers understand that these weren't just numbers, these were neighbors, classmates, someone's daughter who'd called home every Sunday until the Sunday she didn't. Her article about her own sister Sarah went viral. The personal stake, the 16-year search, the journalist who dedicated her career to finding one missing person and ended up exposing 30. The piece was raw, honest, devastating in its clarity about what it cost to lose someone to violence and indifference. Michael read it twice, recognized the grief, the obsession, the way missing people carved holes in the world that nothing could fill. He'd lost his parents young, lost his grandparents to conspiracy, lost his marriage to his own failures. But he'd always known where they were, dead or gone, but accounted for. The families of Blackwell's victims had lived with the uncertainty that was its own kind of torture. Not knowing was worse than knowing. At least knowing let you grieve, let you bury the dead and move forward. Uncertainty kept you frozen, kept you checking your phone for calls that would never come, kept you seeing their face in crowds, kept you hoping when hope was cruelty. The safe house felt like limbo, secure but sterile, protected but imprisoned. Lily needed routine, needed school and friends and normal life. Instead, she had hotel rooms and federal marshals, and a father who spent hours on encrypted calls with prosecutors, building cases that would take months to try. Frank visited daily, shoulder healing but movement still stiff. He'd bring books for Lily, taught her chess in the evenings, talked to Michael about testimony preparation, about what trial would look like, about the long road between arrest and conviction. "You need to understand," Frank said one night after Lily had gone to bed, "Blackwell has resources, top lawyers, political connections that don't evaporate just because he's been arrested. This will be a fight. He'll challenge every piece of evidence, every witness, every conclusion. He'll try to make this about Williams' mental state, about your grandfather's reliability, about whether a dead man's investigation can be trusted." "Can it?" Frank's expression went hard. "Every word in those notebooks has been verified. Every photograph authenticated. Every cross-reference confirmed by independent sources. Williams' work would hold up in any court in this country. But Blackwell will try to break it. Try to break you. Try to make the jury doubt." "I won't break. I know. But knowing and doing are different things. When you're on that stand and his lawyer is calling your grandfather paranoid, calling you opportunistic, calling Lily a prop, you need to remember why we're doing this. Remember those 12 bodies. Remember the families. Remember that truth is on our side, even when it feels like we're losing. Michael nodded, understood. The trial would be warfare in suits. Blackwell fighting for his freedom, Michael fighting for justice. The jury deciding which story to believe, which version of Montana they wanted to accept. Deputy Sarah Chen called on the 10th day, her voice tight with stress. I'm being investigated. Internal affairs. They're saying I leaked confidential information, violated protocols, compromised ongoing investigations. My badge is suspended. I might face charges. For helping us? For doing the right thing? But the right thing looks like betrayal to people who've been protecting Blackwell for decades. Half the department wants me gone. The other half won't look at me. I'm toxic. Michael felt guilt settle in his stomach. She'd risked everything to help them. Now she was paying the price. Kate will protect you, witness protection if necessary. I don't want protection, I want my job. I want to be a cop in my hometown. I want to look my neighbors in the eye without shame. But I'm not sure that's possible anymore. The cost of standing up. The price of conscience. Sarah Chen had chosen truth over loyalty, and her community was punishing her for it. The same community that had looked the other way while Blackwell murdered 30 people. The same neighbors who'd accepted prosperity without asking where the bodies were buried. After the call, Michael stood at the window watching Portland rain turn the city gray. Wondered how many other Sarah Chens existed. People who knew things, saw things, suspected things, but stayed silent because silence was safer than speaking. Because systems protected themselves. Because power rewarded compliance and punished defiance. William Harper hadn't stayed silent, had spoken up, had documented, had built his case knowing it would cost him everything. And it had cost him his grandson, his wife's peace, his final years. But he'd done it anyway because some truths demanded telling, regardless of personal cost. That inheritance was heavier than land or money. It was the burden of knowing, the responsibility to act. The choice to stand when standing meant losing. Michael had accepted that inheritance, had poured out the whiskey, had chosen to fight. Now he was learning what fight actually meant, not just dramatic confrontations and midnight escapes, but grinding legal process, witness preparation, bureaucratic patience, the long, slow work of holding power accountable through systems designed to protect power. Christopher Blackwell appeared on the news 3 days after his father's arrest. Press conference outside his D.C. law office, expensive suit, practiced expression of concern, words chosen by lawyers and focus groups. I love my father, but I support the rule of law. If these allegations are true, justice must be served. My family is cooperating fully with federal investigators. We want the truth as much as anyone. The performance was polished, professional, completely hollow. Michael watched and wondered about the man who'd offered to help, who'd provided financial records, who'd asked for 6 weeks to protect his sister's wedding. Had that been real? Had Christopher actually wanted his father stopped? Or had it been strategy? Controlled leak of information to maintain deniability. Give investigators what they'd find anyway while withholding what really mattered. Frank was skeptical. He gave us good evidence, real evidence, but he also gave us edited evidence, files with gaps, emails referenced but not included. I think he helped just enough to look clean while protecting family interests. Classic lawyer move. Give them truth wrapped in lies, wrapped in plausible deniability. Does it matter? What he gave us was enough. Matters for understanding who we can trust. Christopher Blackwell is playing his own game, protecting his inheritance, his reputation, his future political career. He's not an ally. He's someone who calculated that turning on his father was better than going down with him. Michael thought about that, about Christopher's choice, about protecting family versus pursuing justice, about the calculations people made when forced to choose between blood and law. There was no simple answer, no clear right, just human beings trying to navigate impossible situations with incomplete information and competing loyalties. Martin Cross called on day 14, Michael's uncle, the man who'd testified against William to protect his own children, who'd taken Blackwell's money to send his daughter to college, who'd carried guilt for 27 years. I'm coming to Portland. Need to talk to you, face to face. Tomorrow, if you'll see me, Michael agreed, curiosity outweighing anger, wondering what the man wanted now. Forgiveness? Absolution? Another chance to explain choices that didn't need explaining because Michael understood them perfectly. Understood how easy it was to choose family over strangers, how seductive it was to believe your silence didn't matter, how simple it was to convince yourself that powerful people would do what they wanted regardless of your actions. Martin arrived at the safe house the next morning looking older than 62, worn down by something internal. He sat across from Michael in the sterile living room while federal marshals waited outside. Lily was at a library program with her assigned protection detail. Just two men and decades of complicated history between them. I testified against your grandfather. You know that now? I took Blackwell's money, $30,000 for college scholarships. I told the court William was unstable, paranoid, unfit to raise a child. I'm the reason you went into state custody instead of staying with him. Martin's voice was steady, but his hands shook. I've lived with that for 27 years. Told myself I was protecting my family. Told myself you'd be better off. Told myself William's investigation was dangerous obsession and keeping you away from it was kindness. I believed my own lies because believing them was easier than admitting I sold my nephew for tuition money. Michael said nothing. Let the confession sit between them. Let Martin carry the weight of his own words. I'm testifying at Blackwell's trial. Kate Hayes subpoenaed me. I could fight it, could claim privilege, could find ways to avoid the stand. But I'm not going to. I'm going to tell the jury exactly what I did, how Blackwell's people approached me, what they offered, what I took, how my testimony was used to strip William of custody. Why? Because I'm 62 years old and my daughter doesn't speak to me anymore. Because I thought I was protecting my family, and instead I taught them their father was a coward. Because you're doing what I should have done, and I'll be damned if I fail you again. The words landed heavy. Michael looked at his uncle, saw the broken man underneath, saw someone who'd made bad choices and lived with consequences. Someone seeking redemption he'd probably never fully get. Someone trying to make amends when making it right was impossible. I don't forgive you. I don't expect you to. But I appreciate you testifying. Those families deserve justice. If your testimony helps deliver it, that matters more than our family history. Martin nodded, stood to leave, paused at the door. Your grandfather loved you. Every day you were gone, he talked about you, wondered what you were doing, hoped you were safe. He never stopped loving you, never stopped waiting. I need you to know that. I know. After Martin left, Michael sat alone in the quiet apartment, thinking about choices, about the moments that defined lives, about the weight men carried when they chose wrong and had to live with it. Martin would testify, would confess his betrayal in open court, would try to help Michael win the fight he'd helped Blackwell win 27 years ago. It wasn't redemption. Redemption required making things right. You couldn't make dead people alive, couldn't give William back his grandson, couldn't return 27 years. But it was something. It was a man standing up late instead of never, taking responsibility instead of hiding, trying instead of accepting defeat. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all anyone could do. Try, stand, testify, make the next choice better than the last one, even when the last one couldn't be undone. The grand jury indictments came down 3 weeks after the arrests. Senator Richard Blackwell faced 47 charges, 12 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, corruption of public officials, obstruction of justice. The list went on, each charge carrying decades, each conviction guaranteeing he'd die in federal prison. Sheriff Tucker got 38 counts. Judge Crawford received 31. Andrew Sterling was charged with attempted murder to federal witnesses plus conspiracy charges linking him to the broader operation. The other defendants faced varying charges depending on their roles. Even the lowest-level participants looked at decades in federal prison. Kate held a press conference, standing at a podium with the seal of the Department of Justice behind her. Cameras recording, reporters taking notes, the nation watching as she explained conspiracy that had operated for 40 years. This case represents the complete corruption of public trust. Senator Blackwell and his co-conspirators weaponized systems designed to protect citizens. They murdered young people whose only crime was being in the wrong place. They buried evidence under infrastructure projects. They intimidated witnesses. They bought silence with money and threats. They thought power made them immune. She paused, let the words settle. But one man refused to accept that. William Harper, a Montana rancher, spent 10 years documenting their crimes. When they silenced him by destroying his family, he preserved that evidence and waited. 27 years later, his grandson finished what he started. That's how justice works when ordinary people refuse to accept that evil can operate with impunity. Michael watched the press conference from the safe house, heard his grandfather's name spoken with respect, heard his own role acknowledged, felt the weight of it, the responsibility, the expectation that he'd see this through, that he'd testify, that he'd face Blackwell in court and speak truth that couldn't be denied. Lily climbed into his lap, watched her great-grandfather's photograph on screen, the image Kate was showing. William Harper, young and strong, before age and grief and loss wore him down, before the system broke him, before he made the choice to let his grandson go. "He looks like you, Daddy." Michael studied the photograph, saw the resemblance. Same jaw, same eyes, same stubborn set to the shoulders. Genetic inheritance written in bone structure and facial features. But the real inheritance was deeper, was the choice to stand, the refusal to quit, the commitment to truth regardless of cost. "Yeah, baby, I guess he does. You're gonna finish what he started, right?" "I'm gonna try." That's all he wanted. They wanted it for someone to try. The trial was set for late summer, September, 4 months away. Time for both sides to prepare, time for lawyers to build strategy, time for witnesses to be prepped, and evidence to be organized into presentation that 12 jurors could understand. 4 months of waiting while Blackwell sat in federal detention and his lawyers filed motions and the machinery of justice ground slowly forward. Michael and Lily remained in protective custody. Different safe house now, different city, marshals rotating to prevent pattern recognition. The isolation wore on both of them. Lily missed school, missed friends, missed the ranch, missed normal life where Daddy wasn't preparing to testify against a senator and people weren't trying to kill them. She adapted by drawing, creating detailed pictures of Thunder Ridge Ranch, not as they'd left it, damaged and broken, but as she imagined it could become. Repaired, beautiful, home. The drawings covered the walls of her temporary bedroom, a gallery of hope rendered in crayon and colored pencil, a child's vision of future worth fighting for. Frank visited twice a week, brought updates on the case, on witness preparation, on the ranch. Federal investigators had released the property after documenting everything. The house bore scars, bullet holes patched but visible, bloodstains scrubbed but haunting. But it stood, survived, waited for them to come back. "We can't return until after the trial," Frank said. "Too dangerous. Blackwell's people are still out there. Not all of them were arrested. Some are smart enough to lay low. Wait, see how the trial goes before deciding whether to run or fight. When it's over, will we be safe?" Frank considered the question honestly. Safer. Never completely safe. You've made powerful enemies. Exposed conspiracy that implicates people beyond Blackwell. Political donors, business partners, others who benefited from the arrangement. Some of them will want revenge. Others will want silence. You'll need to be careful. Need to watch your back. Need to understand that finishing this fight means living with targets on you for a long time. The honesty was brutal but necessary. Michael appreciated it. Appreciated that Frank didn't lie. Didn't offer false comfort. Just gave him truth and trusted him to handle it. "I'd rather live with targets than live with cowardice." Frank smiled, wolf-thin, approving. "Your grandfather said almost those exact words 27 years ago. Right before they took you. He knew what it would cost. Did it anyway." The summer passed slowly. Michael studied evidence, prepared testimony, worked with prosecutors on presentation. How to explain Williams' investigation. How to walk jury through documentation. How to make 30 years of conspiracy comprehensible to people who'd never heard of Thunder Ridge Ranch or Senator Blackwell or the pattern of disappearances that became Highway Phil. He met with victim families, spent hours listening to their stories, learning about the people behind the yellow pins, making them real, making them matter. Patricia Blackwood's mother showed him her daughter's nursing school textbooks, still on a shelf, still waiting, still representing dreams that would never be realized. James Running Bear's father performed a ceremony, blessing Michael, thanking him for bringing his son home, for making it possible to lay him to rest according to tradition. The old man's grief was profound. 20 years of not knowing, 20 years of ceremonies incomplete, 20 years of a son's spirit unable to rest. Now finally, there could be peace. Angela Herrera's mother gave him a photograph. Angela at 19, graduation from nursing school, 3 weeks before she vanished. The photo showed a young woman radiant with possibility, with future, with the absolute certainty that life stretched ahead full of opportunity and purpose. "Keep this," she said. "When you testify, remember her. Remember that she wanted to save lives. Remember that Blackwell took that from her. Took it from all of them. Make the jury see what he destroyed." Michael kept the photograph. Studied it often. Let Angela's face remind him why the fight mattered. Why testimony would be hard but necessary. Why facing Blackwell across a courtroom was obligation owed to 30 people who couldn't speak for themselves. Elena Morrison published a series of profiles, one victim each day for 30 days, making each person individual. Distinct. Memorable. Not statistics, not numbers, not abstract casualties of political corruption, but human beings with names and families and lives that mattered. The series went viral, social media sharing the stories, hashtags trending, public opinion solidifying against Blackwell in ways that transcended politics. This wasn't partisan, wasn't left versus right, was basic human decency versus evil, was justice versus corruption, was 30 families who deserved answers versus one man who'd stolen their peace. Reverend Thomas Wade contacted Michael in August, the pastor who'd counseled victim families for 20 years, who'd kept his own ledger of the missing, who'd preserved memories when official systems forgot. "I want to testify," he said. "Want to tell the jury what these families have endured. Want to make those 12 people understand that Blackwell didn't just kill 30 individuals. He killed futures, killed possibilities, killed the people those victims would have become, killed the children they would have raised, killed the lives they would have touched. Murder doesn't just take one life, it takes in all the lives that stem from that life." The theological depth of it, the understanding that killing someone was killing their entire future timeline. Every person they would have influenced, every child they would have raised, every life they would have saved. Angela wanted to be a veterinarian. How many animals would she have healed? How many pet owners would she have comforted? How many students would she have mentored? All of that erased, all of that stolen, not just one death, infinite deaths radiating outward through time. Kate added Wade to the witness list. His testimony would humanize the victims, would make jury understand scope of loss, would ensure that Blackwell's crimes were measured not just in bodies but in futures, in possibilities, in the vast empty spaces where 30 people should have been. 3 weeks before trial, Michael received a letter, no return address, postmarked from Switzerland. Inside, a single page in careful handwriting. "Mr. Brennan, you'll never know if I helped or hurt. I'm not sure I know. My father died in prison last week. Heart attack. He never showed remorse. Maybe couldn't. My mother moved to Arizona, changed her name. My sister hasn't spoken to me since the trial. I gave you what I gave you for reasons I'm still processing. Maybe I wanted him stopped. Maybe I wanted to be the one who stopped him. Maybe I just wanted someone to know I wasn't him. The files I withheld were personal things, family photos, letters to my mother. Nothing that would have changed the verdict, just things I couldn't let strangers see. I'm a coward, Mr. Brennan. Not as big a coward as your Uncle Martin, but close. The difference is, he's trying to make amends. I'm just running. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope your daughter grows up knowing that even cowards sometimes do one right thing. Christopher Blackwell." Michael read the letter twice, tried to parse truth from rationalization, tried to determine if Christopher had helped or hurt, if the evidence he provided was gift or strategy, if his betrayal of his father was courage or calculation. In the end, it didn't matter. The evidence was real, had been verified, had helped build the case. Christopher's motivations were between him and his mirror, between him and whatever he saw when he looked at his own reflection. Some people sought redemption. Some people ran. Both were human responses to impossible choices. Michael filed the letter away, added it to the growing collection of documents related to the case. Another piece of the story, another voice in the chorus of people connected to Blackwell's crimes, victims and witnesses helpers and cowards, people who'd stood up and people who'd run. All of them part of the tapestry that was justice slowly being woven from threads of truth. The night before they left for Montana in the trial, Michael couldn't sleep. Stood at the window of the safe house watching city lights, thinking about tomorrow, about the courtroom, about facing Blackwell, about testimony that would be recorded and analyzed and picked apart by lawyers whose job was to destroy credibility. Frank found him there. Two men in the dark. Coffee instead of harder things. Understanding between them that needed no words. You ready? No, but I'm going anyway. That's all ready means. Showing up when you're scared. Speaking when silence is easier. Standing when sitting is safer. William was ready. William was terrified. Read his journals. The entries before they took you. He was scared out of his mind. Knew what would happen, knew what it would cost. Did it anyway because being terrified and doing it anyway is what courage actually looks like. Michael nodded. Let that truth settle. His grandfather hadn't been fearless, hadn't been superhuman, had been a man, scared and broken and determined, who'd made impossible choice because the alternative was living with silence, living with knowing and not acting, living as accomplice through inaction. I wish I'd known him. You do know him. You're living his choices, fighting his fight, finishing his work. That's knowing someone. That's honoring them. Not perfect memory of childhood, but carrying forward what they started, making their sacrifice mean something. Tomorrow they'd fly to Montana. Tomorrow the trial would begin. Tomorrow Michael would walk into federal courthouse and swear to tell the truth. Would face Blackwell across a courtroom. Would speak for 30 people who couldn't speak for themselves. Would honor his grandfather's decade of work. Would try to give families the justice they'd waited years to receive. Tomorrow was enormous, was terrifying, was the moment everything had been building toward. But tonight, in this quiet safe house, Michael Brennan stood ready, scared but ready, uncertain but ready, knowing he might fail, but ready to try anyway. The inheritance wasn't land, wasn't money, wasn't even the evidence carefully preserved in William's war room. The inheritance was this, the willingness to stand when standing was hard, the commitment to truth when truth was costly, the choice to fight when fighting meant losing everything. William had given him that, had modeled it, had built it into the foundation of who Michael was becoming. And tomorrow, in a federal courtroom in Montana, Michael would prove himself worthy of that inheritance, would speak for the dead, would fight for the living, would honor the sacrifice of a grandfather he barely remembered but knew completely, would finish what William Harper started, no matter what it cost, no matter what it took, no matter who stood in the way. The war was coming. Michael Brennan was ready. The federal courthouse in Helena rose from Montana earth like a monument to order in a state built on wilderness. Stone and glass, authority and procedure. The place where Richard Blackwell's 40 years of careful construction would either hold or collapse under the weight of truth. Michael stood on the steps looking up at the building. Lily's hand in his, Frank beside them. Federal marshals forming a perimeter that kept cameras at distance but couldn't stop lenses from capturing the moment. The grandson of William Harper returning to Montana, coming home to finish what the old rancher started. The narrative had written itself across cable news and social media. The broke carpenter versus the powerful senator. David and Goliath rendered in legal proceedings. America loved that story, needed that story. The possibility that ordinary people could still hold power accountable through systems designed to protect power. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood and older promises. Marble floors, high ceilings, flags hanging motionless in air-conditioned stillness. People moved through halls with purpose. Lawyers carrying briefcases, journalists hunting quotes, families of victims seeking closure, federal marshals ensuring order. The machinery of justice preparing to grind forward whether truth emerged or not. Catherine Hayes met them in a conference room. Sharp suit, sharper eyes. The exhaustion she wore had deepened over the summer. Building this case had consumed her. She'd told Michael once that she'd lost her father to corporate corruption. Coal mine disaster covered up by companies that valued profit over safety. She'd become a prosecutor to fight that kind of evil. This case was her chance to prove the system could work. That justice wasn't just for people who could afford it. The trial starts tomorrow. Jury selection took 2 weeks. We have 12 people with no connections to Montana's political establishment. No ties to Blackwell. No financial interest in his projects. It's as clean a jury as we could hope for. What about his lawyers? The best money can buy. They'll attack Williams' credibility, call his investigation paranoid obsession, claim the evidence is circumstantial, argue that disappearances near construction sites is correlation, not causation. They'll paint Blackwell as a dedicated public servant whose only crime was building Montana's economy. Can they win? Kate's expression hardened. Not if we do our jobs. Not if you testify clearly. Not if the families make the jury understand what was taken. Not if the evidence speaks loud enough. We have bodies. We have DNA. We have financial records. We have witness testimony. We have Williams' documentation. The truth is on our side. We just have to make 12 people believe it. Michael nodded, understood. The trial wasn't about truth in some absolute sense. It was about persuasion, about which story resonated, about whether the jury believed a senator could murder 30 people over 40 years, or whether that seemed too large, too organized, too impossible for one man to orchestrate. Your testimony is critical, Kate continued. You're the emotional center of this case, the grandson who came back, who found his grandfather's evidence, who risked everything to expose conspiracy. The jury needs to trust you, believe you, see you as someone doing this for the right reasons. I'm doing this because 30 people were murdered and their families deserve justice. I know. Make sure the jury knows it too. That evening, Michael walked through Helena, federal marshals trailing at discreet distance. The city felt different from Clearwater. Bigger, more anonymous. State capital where power concentrated and decisions got made that affected lives across Montana. Somewhere in this city, Blackwell had built his empire, had made deals, had ordered deaths, had convinced himself it was all justified by economic development and job creation. The utilitarian calculus of it, the math that said 30 deaths were acceptable cost for prosperity. The lie that some lives mattered less than economic growth. Michael had read philosophy in prison libraries between foster homes, had encountered Peter Singer in trolley problems and arguments about greatest good for greatest number, had understood intellectually how someone could arrive at Blackwell's conclusions. But understanding wasn't accepting. You didn't get to decide other people's lives were expendable, didn't get to make their deaths math problems, didn't get to bury them under highways and call it progress. That was evil wearing the mask of reason. That was murder dressed in economic theory. He found himself at a memorial, small park, bronze plaques listing Montanans who died in various wars, names and dates, someone's son, someone's father, people who'd sacrificed for something larger than themselves. The memorial assumed their deaths mattered, assumed they deserved remembering, assumed a name on bronze meant something. Blackwell's victims didn't even have that. Most had been forgotten, filed away as runaways or accidents. No memorials, no plaques, no official acknowledgement they'd ever existed. Just families carrying private grief and William Harper's yellow pins in a room nobody saw. Tomorrow that would change. Tomorrow a courtroom would hear their names, would see their photographs, would learn their stories, would decide if their deaths mattered enough to punish the man who'd ordered them. The trial began on September 12th, a Tuesday. Clear sky, cool morning. The kind of weather that promised summer was finally releasing its grip on Montana. Michael entered the courtroom with Lily and Frank, took seats behind the prosecution table, watched as the room filled with journalists and victim families and spectators who'd lined up at dawn for limited public seating. Richard Blackwell entered in a dark suit, expensive but not flashy, the carefully calibrated costume of a man who understood optics. He looked smaller than Michael expected. 64 but vigorous, gray hair styled, face that had smiled from campaign posters for decades. Eyes that found Michael's across the courtroom and held them. No flinching, no apology, just calculation, assessment, the look of a man measuring his opponent. His legal team was a wall of suits, 6 lawyers at the defense table, paralegals and assistants filling the rows behind, the full force of wealth deployed in service of avoiding accountability. They moved with practiced efficiency, setting up laptops, organizing binders, building the infrastructure of defense. The judge entered and everyone rose. The Honorable Morrison, federal appointee from Wyoming, no Montana connections, intentions. No political debts to Blackwell, chosen specifically because his impartiality was beyond question. He was 70, silver hair, face that suggested he'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much. Be seated. This court is now in session. The formality of it, the ritual, the ancient dance of justice that predated America and would outlast it. Prosecution and defense, evidence and argument, 12 citizens sitting in judgment. The system was imperfect, but it was what they had. The best tool available for holding power accountable. Kate's opening statement was surgical. She didn't waste words, didn't appeal to emotion yet, just laid out facts. 30 people disappeared over 40 years, all near Blackwell development construction projects, all found buried in fill material beneath highways and bridges, all killed within similar timeframes, all sharing demographic characteristics that made them unlikely to be vigorously pursued by law enforcement. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. This is method. This is Senator Richard Blackwell using construction projects to dispose of victims, using his political power to suppress investigation, using his wealth to silence witnesses, using his influence to corrupt the very systems designed to protect citizens. She paused. Let the words settle. The evidence will show that William Harper, a Montana rancher, spent 10 years documenting this conspiracy, that he gathered proof, that he tried to report it, that he was silenced by having his grandson taken from him, that he preserved his evidence and waited. 27 years later, his grandson finished the work, found the bodies, built the case, made it impossible to ignore. Kate turned toward the jury. 12 faces, 12 strangers who would decide if truth mattered. This trial is about whether power grants immunity, whether wealth excuses murder, whether political influence places someone above the law. The evidence will answer those questions. Will show you that no one, not even a United States senator, is beyond accountability when they commit murder. The defense's opening statement was everything Michael expected. Blackwell's lead attorney was a woman named Rachel Morrison, no relation to the judge. 60-something, silver hair, grandmother's face, prosecutor's instincts turned toward defense work that paid better. She spoke with gentle reasonableness that made her arguments seem obvious. Senator Blackwell has devoted his life to public service, 40 years building Montana's economy, creating jobs, improving infrastructure, making this state prosperous. The prosecution wants you to believe this dedicated public servant is a serial killer, that he murdered 30 people, buried them in construction projects, operated a 40-year conspiracy without anyone noticing. She smiled slightly, inviting the jury to share her skepticism. The evidence will show something different. Will show that William Harper was a troubled man, that his investigation was obsession born from grief after losing his daughter, that he saw patterns that didn't exist, connected dots that had no connection, built conspiracy theories from coincidence and confirmation bias. Yes, people disappeared, tragically. But Montana is a big state. People disappear for many reasons. Voluntary departure, accidents, crimes committed by others. The prosecution wants you to believe all these disappearances are connected, that one man orchestrated all of them. But the evidence will show coincidence, not conspiracy, correlation, not causation. She gestured toward Blackwell, sitting calm at the defense table, looking every inch the statesman. Senator Blackwell is innocent. The evidence will prove it, and at the end of this trial you will have no choice but to acquit. The prosecution's case began that afternoon. Kate built methodically. Started with forensic evidence, the bodies, DNA matches to missing persons, cause of death determinations, time of death estimates, making the deaths real, making them undeniable. 12 people recovered, 12 identities confirmed, 12 murders that couldn't be explained away. The forensic pathologist was professional, dispassionate. He described each body, each injury, each conclusion about how death occurred. Blunt force trauma, strangulation, gunshot wounds, different methods but similar disposal. All buried in construction, fill, all sealed beneath infrastructure. Dr. Martinez, can you explain the significance of the burial locations? The pathologist nodded. Each body was positioned in excavations that were subsequently filled with concrete or asphalt. The timing suggests the victims were placed shortly before fill material was added. This required access to construction sites, knowledge of project timelines, coordination with site operations. Could these deaths be unrelated coincidences? The statistical likelihood of 12 murder victims independently being buried at different Blackwell development construction sites approaches zero. This demonstrates coordination, planning, system. The defense's cross-examination focused on uncertainty, on what the evidence couldn't prove rather than what it could. Rachel Morrison was good. She acknowledged the bodies, acknowledged the deaths, but questioned whether they proved Blackwell's involvement. Dr. Martinez, you've confirmed these people were murdered and buried in construction sites, but you haven't testified that Senator Blackwell killed them, correct? I can't determine who committed the murders from physical evidence alone. So it's possible that someone else used Blackwell development sites without his knowledge? It's possible, though unlikely given the frequency and coordination required. But possible? Many things are possible. Morrison smiled, made her point, planted doubt. That was her job. Make the impossible seem possible. Make the unlikely seem reasonable. Make 12 deaths at 12 different Blackwell sites seem like coincidence rather than method. The second day brought financial evidence. Forensic accountants walked the jury through shell companies, money transfers, payment structures that obscured who was paying whom for what. Kate had simplified complex paper trails into visual presentations, flowcharts showing money moving from Blackwell's personal accounts through layers of corporate entities before ending up with contractors, officials, and individuals connected to the case. These payments coincide with disappearances, Kate explained. Money flowing just before and after victims vanished. Payments to construction foremen, to equipment operators, to people who would have been in position to facilitate disposal. The defense countered that payments proved nothing, that construction projects involved hundreds of transactions, that finding payments near disappearances was confirmation bias, cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion. But the accumulation was damning. Each piece of evidence alone might be inconclusive. Together they formed a picture, a pattern, a method. The jury's faces showed concentration. They were following, understanding, starting to see what Kate wanted them to see. Michael was called to testify on day 8. He'd spent the previous week watching other witnesses, listening to testimony, learning the rhythm of trial. Now it was his turn, his chance to speak for William, to explain the investigation, to make the jury understand what his grandfather had sacrificed. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, took the seat, looked at the jury. 12 strangers who would decide if his testimony mattered. Kate approached with questions they'd rehearsed. Mr. Brennan, how did you come to possess your grandfather's investigation? I inherited his ranch, found his study. Inside was 10 years of documentation, maps, photographs, notebooks, evidence he'd collected trying to prove people were being murdered. Why didn't your grandfather go to authorities? He tried, multiple times, filed reports with state police, FBI, tried to interest journalists. Every avenue was blocked. Then social services took me away from him, used false testimony to strip custody. My Uncle Martin testified my grandfather was unfit, was paid by Blackwell's people to do it. That testimony was used to separate us, to silence my grandfather by taking away what he loved most. Michael's voice remained steady, factual. He'd learned not to let emotion overwhelm the narrative, to present truth without drama. Let the facts speak. What did you do after finding the evidence? I contacted federal authorities, provided Williams documentation, built on his work using modern tools he didn't have access to, cross-referenced missing persons with construction projects, found the pattern, made it impossible to ignore. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. Rachel Morrison came at him with everything, attacked his credibility, his motives, his grandfather's mental state. Mr. Brennan, you were living in your truck when you inherited the ranch, correct? Yes. Unemployed? Yes. Facing financial hardship? Yes. So you had significant motivation to create a narrative that would generate publicity, book deals, movie rights, financial gain from your grandfather's tragedy. Michael kept his voice level. I refused $5 million from Senator Blackwell to stay silent. If money motivated me, I'd have taken that offer and disappeared. The courtroom rippled. Morrison's expression tightened. You claim Senator Blackwell offered you $5 million? His representative, Andrew Sterling, made the offer. It's documented, recorded. Sterling is under indictment for attempted murder of federal witnesses related to the ranch attack. Morrison moved on, tried different angles, suggested William was paranoid, suggested Michael was influenced by a disturbed man's delusions, suggested the evidence was confirmation bias and pattern seeking in random events. But Michael had lived with the evidence for months, knew every detail, every connection, every piece of documentation. When Morrison suggested correlation wasn't causation, he countered with specifics, dates, names, payments, the accumulation of facts that individually might be dismissed but collectively formed undeniable truth. Your Honor, Morrison finally said, I have no further questions. Kate stood for redirect. Mr. Brennan, your grandfather sacrificed his relationship with you to preserve this evidence. Why do you think he did that? Michael looked at the jury. Because some truths are worth any cost. Because 30 people deserve justice. Because my grandfather believed in a system that would eventually work if someone cared enough to make it work. He gave up everything he loved to build this case. I'm just trying to make sure his sacrifice mattered. The courtroom was silent when he stepped down. Lily was crying quietly. Frank put his arm around her. Michael returned to his seat feeling hollowed out. Testimony was exposure, was vulnerability, was standing naked before strangers and trusting them to see truth rather than weakness. Martin Cross testified on day 9. Michael's uncle took the stand looking like he'd aged a decade in months. Kate's questions were direct. Mr. Cross, what was your relationship to William Harper? He was my father-in-law, married to my wife Sarah. After Sarah died, William tried to get custody of his grandson Michael. The court denied him. Why did the court deny custody? I testified against him, said he was unstable, paranoid, unfit to raise a child. Kate paused. Let that admission settle. Why did you testify against William Harper? Because Blackwell's people approached me, offered money, $30,000 for college scholarships for my children, in exchange for testimony that would strip William of custody. Did you believe William was unfit? No, I knew he was investigating real crimes, knew the evidence was real, knew he was being targeted, but I chose my family's financial security over his grandson's welfare. I took the money and lied. The courtroom absorbed the confession. Martin's voice cracked, but he continued. I've lived with that choice for 27 years. Told myself I was protecting my family. But I was just a coward. I chose money over truth, silence over justice. My testimony helped Blackwell silence the one man trying to stop him. Why testify now? Because I'm 62 years old and my daughter won't speak to me. Because I taught my children their father was a coward and they learned the lesson. Because Michael is doing what I should have done. And if my testimony helps convict Blackwell, maybe my betrayal will finally mean something other than shame. The defense barely cross-examined. What could they say? Martin had confessed, had detailed Blackwell's payment, had explained how the system was corrupted, had shown how witnesses were bought and investigations were killed. The victim impact statements began on day 12. Kate had saved them for last. Wanted the jury to understand what Blackwell had taken, who these people were, what their deaths meant. Patricia Blackwood's mother spoke first, 73, bent by grief, voice that shook but held. My daughter was 20, nursing student. She disappeared walking home from the library. For 15 years, I believed she'd run away, believed she'd chosen to leave me. That belief killed me slowly, made me doubt my parenting, doubt her love, doubt everything. Then they found her body, under a highway, buried like trash, and I learned she'd never left me, never stopped loving me. She was taken, murdered, thrown away. The woman's voice broke. Senator Blackwell didn't just kill my daughter. He killed 15 years of hope, killed my belief in human goodness, killed my faith that justice existed. I died the day Patricia disappeared. Her body being found just made the death official. James Running Bear's father spoke in his tribal language, then repeated in English. The cadence was ceremonial. The grief was universal. My son wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help his people. He disappeared coming home from college. We performed ceremonies for 20 years trying to help his spirit rest. But how can a spirit rest when the body is buried without honor? When death comes from evil rather than natural cycle? The old man looked at Blackwell. You took my son, took his future, took the children he would have taught, took the healing he would have brought to our people. You thought indigenous lives didn't matter, thought we wouldn't be believed, thought you could erase us like we've been erased for centuries. But we matter. My son mattered. And today, in this court, you will learn that some debts must be paid. Some crimes cannot be hidden. Some truths cannot be silenced. Angela Herrera's mother was last. She was 58 but looked older, carrying a photograph of her daughter at 19. Nursing school graduation. 3 weeks before she vanished. Angela wanted to save lives, wanted to heal, wanted to make the world better. She was my only child, my heart, my future. When she disappeared, police said runaway, said she'd chosen to leave. I spent 16 years wondering what I'd done wrong. What made her want to escape me? I died believing my daughter hated me. The woman's tears came freely now. Then they found her, under a parking lot, like garbage. And I learned she'd never left, never stopped loving me. She was murdered, taken, destroyed. She looked at the jury. Senator Blackwell took my daughter's life, took my 16 years believing I'd failed her, took my chance to grieve properly, to bury her with honor, to say goodbye. He took everything. And now I'm asking you, 12 strangers, please don't let him take justice too. Please don't let money and power excuse murder. Please make him pay for what he stole. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors were crying. Even the judge looked affected. Blackwell sat motionless, face empty, either genuinely sociopathic or performing sociopathy. Michael couldn't tell which. The defense rested without calling Blackwell to testify. Smart move. Putting him on the stand would expose him to Kate's cross-examination, would risk him saying something that contradicted evidence, would humanize him in ways that might backfire. Better to maintain the statesman image, the dignified silence of someone above such accusations. Closing arguments happened on day 14. 2 weeks of testimony distilled into final appeals. Kate spoke without notes. For 40 years, Richard Blackwell murdered people and buried them beneath Montana's infrastructure. 30 lives, 30 futures, 30 families destroyed. He thought power made him immune, thought wealth excused evil, thought political influence placed him above consequences. But one man refused to accept that. William Harper, a Montana rancher, spent 10 years building this case, documenting crimes, collecting evidence, preserving truth. They silenced him by taking his grandson, by destroying his family, by weaponizing systems meant to protect children. 27 years later, his grandson finished the work, found the bodies, exposed the conspiracy, made it impossible to ignore. She gestured toward the evidence, the photographs, the timelines, the financial records. The truth is in this room, in the bodies we recovered, in the DNA that proves identity, in the financial records showing payments, in the testimony of witnesses who explain method, in William Harper's documentation showing pattern across 40 years. Richard Blackwell is guilty. The evidence proves it. Your verdict must reflect that truth, must show that power doesn't grant immunity, that wealth doesn't excuse murder, that no one, not even a senator, is above the law. The defense's closing was Rachel Morrison at her best. She acknowledged the tragedy, acknowledged the deaths, but questioned whether evidence proved Blackwell's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. These deaths are tragedies. These families have suffered. No one disputes that. But tragedy doesn't prove conspiracy. Coincidence doesn't prove coordination. The prosecution has shown you terrible things, but have they proven Richard Blackwell did them? She walked through the evidence, pointing out gaps, uncertainties, alternative explanations. The bodies were found at construction sites, but hundreds of people had access to those sites. The financial records show payments, but construction projects involve thousands of payments. Witness testimony suggests coordination, but suggests isn't proves. The prosecution has built a theory, a story, a narrative about power and corruption. But stories aren't evidence. Theory isn't proof. You must decide based on facts beyond reasonable doubt. She faced the jury directly. Is it possible Richard Blackwell is guilty? Yes. Is it proven beyond reasonable doubt? That's your decision. But I submit that doubt exists, that uncertainty remains, that the prosecution has not met its burden. And in America, doubt means acquittal. Uncertainty means innocence. The burden is on them to prove guilt, not on us to prove innocence. If you have doubt, you must acquit. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 72 hours of waiting. Michael and Lily remained at the hotel. Federal marshals maintaining security, Frank bringing updates, Kate preparing for verdict, whichever way it went. The waiting was torture, worse than testimony. Worse than cross-examination. Worse than anything except the years William had waited, the decades families had waited, the silence they'd endured. On the third day, word came. Verdict reached. Courtroom reconvening at 2 p.m. Michael dressed Lily in her best clothes. Goodwill finds but clean, pressed, dignified. She'd sat through 2 weeks of trial, heard terrible things, seen her father testify, watched families weep. She deserved to see the end, deserved to witness justice if justice came. The courtroom filled quickly. Journalists, families, spectators, federal marshals maintaining order. Everyone rising as Judge Morrison entered. Everyone sitting, everyone holding breath. Has the jury reached a verdict? The forewoman stood. Older woman, teacher's bearing. She held a paper that contained the future. We have, Your Honor. The clerk took the paper, handed it to the judge. Morrison read it, face revealing nothing, handed it back. The defendant will rise. Blackwell stood, Rachel Morrison beside him. The courtroom utterly silent. On the charge of murder in the first degree, count 1, how do you find? Guilty. The word landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spreading outward. Someone gasped. Someone sobbed. Michael felt Lily's hand squeeze his. On the charge of murder in the first degree, count 2, how do you find? Guilty. Count 3, guilty. 12 counts, 12 murders, 12 times the forewoman said guilty, then conspiracy charges, guilty, racketeering, guilty, corruption, guilty, obstruction of justice, guilty. 47 charges, 47 guilty verdicts. Richard Blackwell convicted on every count. The courtroom erupted, families weeping, journalists rushing for doors, Blackwell's lawyers requesting immediate appeal, the judge banging gavel, order, order. Blackwell himself showed nothing, face empty, either accepting inevitability or still believing wealth would eventually save him. Michael couldn't tell, didn't care. The jury had spoken. 12 citizens had looked at evidence and chosen truth. Sentencing was set for 2 weeks later. Time for both sides to present arguments about appropriate punishment. But the verdict was final. Blackwell was guilty, would die in prison, would never walk free, would never hurt anyone again. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught Michael and Lily and Frank. Questions shouted. Microphones thrust. Michael stopped, looked at the lenses, spoke words he'd prepared for this moment. Justice has been served. 30 families can finally grieve properly, can finally bury their loved ones with honor, can finally have peace. My grandfather, William Harper, spent 10 years building this case, sacrificed everything to preserve truth. Today, his sacrifice was validated. Today, the system he believed in finally worked. He paused, looked at Lily. I want my daughter to grow up knowing that ordinary people can hold power accountable. That truth matters. That justice is possible when people care enough to fight for it. Thank you. He walked away, ignored follow-up questions, got into the waiting SUV with federal marshals, drove away from the courthouse and the cameras and the weight of 2 weeks watching justice slowly grind forward. In the SUV, Lily climbed into his lap. We won, Daddy. Yeah, baby, we won. Great-Grandpa Bill would be proud. Michael looked out the window at Helena passing by, at the state capitol dome gleaming in afternoon sun, at the city where Blackwell had built his empire and seen it fall. Yeah, I think he would be. That night, alone in the hotel room after Lily slept, Michael allowed himself to feel it. The victory, the weight lifting, the knowledge that William's sacrifice had mattered, that 27 years of waiting had led to this, that truth had won. But the feeling was complicated, bittersweet, victory mixed with grief, justice delivered but delivered late, families who had their answers but couldn't have their loved ones back, a grandfather vindicated but dead before seeing vindication. Frank called to congratulate, to share the moment, to acknowledge what they'd accomplished together. William would be proud, the old FBI agent said, not just of the verdict, but of you, of the man you've become, of how you honored his work. I had help. You, Kate, Elena, the families, everyone who stood up. That's how it works. No one does this alone. Justice is collective, requires ordinary people making extraordinary choices. William made his choice. You made yours. Together they mattered. After the call, Michael stood at the window, looking at Helena lights, thinking about inheritance, about what gets passed down, about the weight of honoring the dead by finishing their work. He'd inherited a ranch, found evidence, built a case, testified, won conviction, done what William couldn't do, finished what his grandfather started. But the real inheritance was deeper, was the choice itself, the commitment to stand, the refusal to accept that power granted immunity, that wealth excused evil, that ordinary people were powerless against extraordinary corruption. William had modeled that, had shown Michael what courage looked like, what sacrifice meant, what legacy really was. And now Michael would carry it forward, would teach Lily, would return to Thunder Ridge Ranch and rebuild, would make William's war room into something that mattered, something that helped other families, other cases, other people seeking justice. The verdict was victory, but the work wasn't finished. It was just beginning. Tomorrow, they'd fly back to Portland, wait for sentencing, prepare for the next phase, the appeals, the continued security concerns, the long process of actually rebuilding a life after months of trials and testimony. But tonight, in this hotel room, with his daughter sleeping and his grandfather's sacrifice validated, Michael Brennan allowed himself one moment of peace, one moment of knowing he'd done what he'd promised. He'd finished what William started. He'd made the inheritance matter. And somewhere in whatever came after death, William Harper could finally rest, could finally release the burden he'd carried, could finally know that his grandson had come home, had cared enough to look, had fought hard enough to win. Justice delivered late, but justice delivered complete, the way it was supposed to work, when the system functioned as designed. The sentencing hearing happened on a January morning when Montana wind howled outside the courthouse and snow fell in sheets that made visibility impossible. Inside was warmth and light and the business of allocating consequences for 40 years of murder. Judge Morrison presided with the gravity appropriate to crimes that had destroyed families across multiple states. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, victim families in the front rows, journalists filling every available seat. America watching through cameras allowed for this final chapter. Richard Blackwell entered in an orange jumpsuit, no expensive suit this time, no carefully calibrated costume, just the uniform of the convicted. He looked smaller still, diminished by 2 months in federal detention, by the reality that money couldn't buy his way out, that appeals would take years and likely fail, that he would die in prison regardless of how long he lived. Judge Morrison looked at him without expression. Mr. Blackwell, you have been convicted of 47 counts, including 12 murders. Before this court imposes sentence, you have the right to address the court. Do you wish to speak? Blackwell's lawyers whispered urgent advice, told him to show remorse, to apologize, to give the court something that might reduce sentence. But Blackwell shook them off, stood, faced the judge with the same calculation Michael had seen across the courtroom during trial. I maintain my innocence. This prosecution was politically motivated. Evidence was fabricated. My conviction will be overturned on appeal. History will vindicate me. Montana needed progress and I delivered it. Everything I did served the greater good. The words fell into silence. No remorse, no acknowledgement, no acceptance of reality. Blackwell still believed in his own righteousness, still convinced himself that 30 deaths were justified by economic development, that murder was acceptable mathematics. Judge Morrison's expression never changed. Mr. Blackwell, the jury has spoken. 12 citizens heard evidence, evaluated testimony, and found you guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Your belief in your own innocence is irrelevant to the reality of your crimes. Your claim of serving a greater good rings hollow when measured against 12 murdered young people and the families you destroyed. He paused, let the words settle. This court now proceeds to sentencing. The sentences accumulated like stones, each count carrying its own weight, each murder its own life term. 12 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, guaranteeing Blackwell would die in federal custody. Additional decades for conspiracy, racketeering, corruption. The total exceeded 400 years, symbolic since one life was all he could serve, but meaningful in demonstrating scope and certainty he would never walk free. Sheriff Raymond Tucker received 85 years. Judge Helen Crawford got 60. Andrew Sterling was sentenced to 40 for attempted murder and conspiracy. The construction executives and shell company officers received terms ranging from 15 to 50 years, depending on their involvement. When Morrison finished, 23 convicted criminals faced federal imprisonment. Conspiracy shattered. Decades of unpunished crime finally meeting consequence. The families wept, some from relief, some from grief that justice couldn't bring back the dead, all from the exhaustion of years spent fighting systems designed to protect power. Michael watched Blackwell being led away in chains. The former senator didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the families, didn't show any emotion beyond the calculation that had defined him. He was 64 years old, would spend whatever remained of his life in a cell, would die without freedom, without power, without the empire he'd built on graves. Outside the courthouse, snow had stopped, sky clearing to that crystalline blue that only happened after storms. Michael stood on the steps with Lily and Frank, cameras waiting, questions ready, but this time he had something different to say. Today, justice was served, but justice is just the beginning. Conviction doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't heal decades of grief, doesn't undo the damage Richard Blackwell caused. He paused, found the cameras. That's why we're not stopping here. Thunder Ridge Ranch will become the William and Margaret Harper Justice Center, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating cold cases, supporting families of missing persons, training citizens to recognize and report suspicious activity, making sure other families don't suffer what these families suffered. My grandfather spent 10 years building evidence, 27 years waiting for someone to care. His sacrifice will mean more than one conviction. It'll mean a system that keeps fighting, keeps investigating, keeps demanding accountability. Lily stepped forward, small voice amplified by microphones. Great-Grandpa Bill wanted people to remember, wanted the missing to have names, wanted families to have answers. We're going to help make that happen. The image made every news cycle. 8-year-old girl standing beside her father, promising to honor a great-grandfather she'd never met, promising to turn tragedy into purpose, promising to make inheritance mean something beyond property and money. The return to Thunder Ridge Ranch happened in March when Montana winter was surrendering to spring and the land was remembering how to be green. Federal investigators had released the property months earlier, but Michael had waited, wanted the trial finished, wanted Blackwell convicted and sentenced, wanted to come back knowing the fight was won. The ranch materialized through morning mist like a promise kept. The house had been repaired during their absence. Frank had hired contractors, secured the structures, made it livable again. The bullet holes were patched, windows replaced, bloodstains removed. The scars remained but healed, visible but no longer bleeding. Frank met them at the property line, shoulder fully healed now, face showing relief at seeing them return. He'd spent the winter working, preparing, building something that would honor William's memory while serving present need. Welcome home. Lily ran to him, hugged him with the unself-conscious affection of children who recognize family when they found it. Frank had become grandfather to her, the role William never got to fill, the relationship built through choice rather than blood. The main house had been transformed, part museum, part office, part home. William's study was preserved exactly as they'd found it. Maps still covered walls, yellow pins still marked victims, evidence still cataloged and cross-referenced. But now it served as educational space, place where investigators could learn, where William's methodology could be studied, where his decade of work could teach others how to build cases against power. The rest of the house became operational center, office wing for investigators and case managers and family liaison staff, conference room for reviewing evidence, library for research, living quarters for Michael and Lily and Frank, who'd moved in permanently. No longer the cabin hermit drinking alone. Now family, now purpose, now reason to keep breathing beyond stubborn refusal to die. The barn had been completely rebuilt, the collapsed corner restored, the structure reinforced with engineering that would last another century. Inside, training facility, classroom space, computer stations, equipment for evidence analysis, everything needed to teach ordinary citizens how to investigate, how to document, how to hold systems accountable when systems failed. Lily's bedroom was painted pale yellow. New furniture Frank had built with his own hands, desk for homework, shelves for books, window looking out over grassland that rolled toward mountains, space for an 8-year-old, soon to be 9, to grow and dream and imagine futures beyond courtrooms and testimonies and the weight of honoring the dead. The transformation had taken months, cost money raised through donations and grants, and the settlement from suing Blackwell Development for wrongful death. $5 million, the same amount Andrew Sterling had offered as bribe, now serving justice instead of silence, distributed to victim families, used to endow the center, ensuring it would operate regardless of economic conditions or political climates. The Harper Justice Center opened officially in April, ceremony attended by victim families and local officials, and media covering Montana's emergence from Blackwell's shadow. Reverend Thomas Wade performed blessing, speaking words in English and Blackfoot in languages that predated America, honoring all the victims, all the families, all the futures stolen. Elena Morrison had become communications director, using her journalism skills to tell stories, to raise awareness, to ensure the missing weren't forgotten. She'd written a book about the case, about her sister Sarah and the 16-year search that led to exposing Blackwell. Proceeds went to the center, her personal tragedy transformed into public service. Deputy Sarah Chen joined as chief investigator. She'd been exonerated by federal review, commended for her courage. But Clearwater Sheriff Department never took her back. The town that raised her couldn't forgive her for choosing truth over loyalty, so she'd moved to Thunder Ridge, made it home, found family among people who understood the price of standing up. Frank became operations director, his FBI experience ensuring investigations met standards that would hold up in court, his contacts providing access to federal resources. His guilt over failing William transformed into tireless work honoring William's memory. The center took on its first case in May. Family from Bozeman, daughter missing 6 years. Sheriff wouldn't investigate, said she'd run away. But the family knew, felt it. Their daughter wouldn't leave without word, wouldn't abandon them. Something was wrong. Sarah Chen led the investigation, found witnesses police never interviewed, discovered financial records suggesting foul play, built timeline that made runaway narrative impossible. Within 3 months, they located remains, identified killer, built case that led to arrest and conviction. One family out of thousands, one case out of hundreds that fell through cracks. But it mattered to that mother who could finally bury her daughter, mattered to that father who could finally grieve properly, mattered as proof that William's model worked, that ordinary people with determination and resources could achieve what official systems sometimes failed to accomplish. By the end of the first year, the center had taken on 23 cases. Symbolic number. Same as William's original count. 3 were solved, 3 families got answers, 3 sets of remains were recovered, 3 murderers faced justice. 3 communities learned that some crimes would be pursued even when local authorities looked away. The work was hard, slow, often heartbreaking. Most cases didn't solve. Most families didn't get the closure they sought, but trying mattered. Caring mattered. Refusing to accept that some lives were less important than others mattered. Michael found rhythm in the work. Days spent investigating, evenings with Lily helping with homework, nights reviewing evidence and planning next steps. He'd been sober now for over a year, attending meetings in town, finding community among other people, learning to live without chemical escapes, finding strength in admitting weakness, finding grace in imperfection. Lily thrived, enrolled in local school, made friends who knew her story but treated her normally, became the kid whose great-grandfather took down a senator, wore that identity with quiet pride, started volunteering at the center, helping organize files, learning investigation basics, absorbing lessons about justice and persistence and what one person could accomplish when they refused to quit. Frank taught her chess in the evenings, patient explanations of strategy and sacrifice, how sometimes you gave up pieces to win the game, how thinking 3 moves ahead mattered more than immediate advantage, how patience defeated aggression. Lessons about chess that were really lessons about life. On Lily's 9th birthday, they held small celebration at the ranch, cake that Frank baked himself, presents modest but thoughtful. Victim families sent cards, sent well wishes, sent love to the little girl who'd stood up in court and reminded everyone why the fight mattered. That night, after Lily slept, Michael stood on the porch where William had stood decades earlier, looking at Montana stars, thinking about inheritance, about what gets passed forward, about legacy measured not in money but in meaning. He'd come to this ranch broken, living in his truck, $800 from catastrophe, angry at grandparents he'd believed abandoned him, ready to sell everything and disappear into whatever came next. Instead, he'd found evidence, found purpose, found family in Frank and Elena and Sarah and all the people who'd chosen to fight alongside him, found himself in the process of honoring William's sacrifice. The ranch wasn't just a property now, was home, was monument, was weapon against the kind of evil that thought power granted immunity, was proof that ordinary people could matter, could change things, could hold the powerful accountable when they chose to stand. 2 years after the trial, Michael received a letter, forwarded through the center, postmarked from federal prison in Colorado. Handwriting shaky but legible, from Richard Blackwell. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, no apology, no remorse, just calculation even from behind bars. Mr. Brennan, you won. I acknowledge that. The jury believed your story. The judge imposed sentence. I will die in this cell, but I want you to understand something. Montana thrived under my leadership. Jobs were created. Infrastructure was built. Families prospered. Yes, some died, 30 people over 40 years. But tens of thousands live better because of what I built. That's the mathematics you refuse to acknowledge. That's the greater good you can't see. History will judge which of us was right. History will measure my 30 against my 10,000. And history, I believe, will judge me kindly. Richard Blackwell. Michael read the letter twice, felt the cold logic of it, the utilitarian calculation, the belief that some deaths were acceptable costs for general prosperity, the mathematics that reduced human lives to numbers in an equation. He thought about responding, thought about explaining why Blackwell was wrong, why you couldn't measure lives that way, why 30 people weren't numbers but futures, weren't statistics but souls, why economic development didn't justify murder. But he didn't write back, didn't engage. Blackwell had spent his life believing his own justifications, believing power made him right, believing wealth excused evil. A letter wouldn't change that. Nothing would change that. Instead, Michael took the letter to William's study, pinned it to the wall beside the yellow pins, beside the photographs of victims, beside the evidence of 40 years of crimes. Let Blackwell's own words stand as testimony to the mindset that made conspiracy possible. The belief that some lives mattered less than others. The calculus that turned people into acceptable losses. That afternoon, a new family arrived at the center. Parents from Missoula. Son missing 3 years. Police said runaway. But parents knew, felt it. Their boy wouldn't leave without word, wouldn't abandon them. Something was wrong. Sarah Chen sat with them, listened to their story, took notes, asked careful questions, began building timeline. Michael watched from the office, saw the hope in their faces, the desperate belief that someone would finally care, finally look, finally fight for their child. He knew that hope might lead to heartbreak, knew most cases didn't solve, knew the center couldn't save everyone, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't undo years of grief. But they could try, could care, could refuse to accept that some missing people didn't matter enough to pursue the community. That was William's legacy, not the conviction of one senator, not even the recovery of 30 bodies, but the proof that ordinary people could build systems of accountability when official systems failed. Frank appeared beside him. 2 men watching Sarah work, watching another family seek justice. She's good at this. She learned from the best, from William's documentation, from your FBI training, from all of us learning together. William would be proud of all of it. The center, the work, you. Michael nodded, felt the weight of that. The responsibility of honoring a man he'd barely known but understood completely. A man who'd sacrificed everything, who'd built case knowing he might never see justice delivered, who'd trusted that someday someone would care enough to finish what he started. I hope so. I know so. You finished his work, made his sacrifice matter, turned his war room into something that helps people. That's legacy. That's what inheritance really means. That evening, after the Missoula family left with promises the center would investigate, Michael took Lily to William's grave, simple stone in the ranch cemetery, names and dates, William Harper, Margaret Harper, together again after years apart. Lily placed flowers she'd picked from the meadow, wildflowers, Montana blooms, the kind that grew without cultivation, that thrived without attention, that came back every year regardless of weather or circumstance. Do you think he knows about the center, about what we're doing? I don't know, baby. I hope so. Do you think he's proud? Michael looked at his daughter, 9 years old, growing into someone who understood justice and sacrifice and what it meant to stand for something larger than yourself. Yeah, I think wherever he is, whatever comes after, he's proud of you, of all of us, of what we built from what he left. They stood in silence, wind moving through grass, sky turning colors as sun set over mountains. The land stretched away in every direction, wild and beautiful and indifferent to human drama. It would be here long after they were gone, long after the center closed, long after everyone who remembered William was dead. But what they'd built would echo, would influence, would change the trajectory of lives in ways they'd never know. That was legacy, not monuments, not buildings that would eventually crumble, but choices that rippled outward, actions that inspired others to act, truth spoken that empowered others to speak. 3 years after the trial, the center had assisted in solving 47 cold cases across 12 states. Not all successes, many failures, many families still waiting, many questions still unanswered, but 47 cases where someone cared, where investigators followed evidence, where families got closure. 16 families found their missing, 16 sets of remains recovered, 16 funerals held with bodies present instead of empty caskets and unanswered questions, 16 mothers and fathers and siblings and children who could finally grieve properly, finally let go, finally heal. The center became model for similar operations in other states. Oregon, Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, people inspired by William's story, by Michael's determination, by the proof that ordinary citizens could build systems of accountability, could investigate when officials wouldn't, could demand justice when systems failed. Elena's book became bestseller. Movie rights were sold, money poured into the center, funded expansion, hired more investigators, provided better resources, allowed them to take on cases they couldn't have handled before. But success brought challenges. Growth meant bureaucracy. Donors meant expectations. Fame meant scrutiny. The simple purity of purpose that defined the early days gave way to complexity of running actual organization. Michael found himself in meetings about budgets and strategic planning and donor relations. Found himself managing staff and resolving conflicts and making decisions about which cases to pursue and which to decline. Found himself becoming administrator when he'd wanted to remain investigator. Frank saw the struggle, recognized the burden. One evening after another frustrating meeting about grant requirements, he found Michael on the porch. "This isn't what you signed up for." "No, I wanted to finish William's work. Instead, I'm filling out paperwork and managing personalities and worrying about funding cycles." That is finishing William's work. Building something that lasts requires different skills than building something that matters. You did both. Made it matter. Now you're making it last. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. That's how you know you're doing it right. Complacency means you've stopped caring. Frustration means you still believe it could be better. Michael nodded, understood intellectually, but emotionally the weight pressed. The responsibility of honoring William while managing reality, of staying true to mission while adapting to growth, of maintaining purity of purpose while accepting complexity of execution. What would William do? Frank smiled, wolf-thin, knowing exactly what you're doing. Building something imperfect that helps people. Getting frustrated when it's not enough. Pushing forward anyway because quitting is an option. You're more like him than you know. 5 years after the trial, Lily turned 13. Teenager navigating middle school and social media and the complexity of being the girl whose family took down a senator. She'd grown, changed, become someone Michael barely recognized from the 8-year-old who'd slept in his truck. She'd started writing stories about the victims, poems about loss and justice and hope. Her English teacher said she had talent, said her work showed depth unusual for someone her age, said trauma had given her insight most teenagers lacked. Michael read her writing with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. Pride in her talent, heartbreak that she'd experienced things that gave her such insight, that she'd sat through trials and heard testimony and learned about evil before most kids worried about much beyond homework and friends. One evening, she showed him a poem titled The Inheritance, about William and Michael and the weight of finishing other people's fights, about how legacy was burden and gift simultaneously, about how you could honor the dead by living well. This is beautiful, baby. It's about you, about great-grandpa, about what you both did. It's about all of us, about choosing to stand when sitting is easier. Is it worth it? All of this, the work, the wait? Michael thought about the question, about the families they'd helped, about the cases they'd solved, about the people in prison because the center had investigated when no one else would, about the systems of accountability they'd built, about the proof that ordinary people mattered. Ask the families we've helped. Ask the mothers who finally got to bury their children. Ask the fathers who finally got answers. Ask the communities where murderers were caught because someone cared enough to look. But is it worth it to you? The question cut deeper. To him, not to the mission. To the man who'd poured 5 years into honoring a grandfather he barely knew, who'd sacrificed normal life, who'd lived with targets on his back, who'd chosen burden over ease. Yeah, baby, it's worth it. Not every day, not every moment. But overall, yes, making William's sacrifice matter, helping people who have nowhere else to turn, showing you that standing for something is possible. That's worth the wait. Lily hugged him, tight, the way she used to when she was small. Good, because I'm going to keep doing it too. When I'm older, I'm going to be an investigator, going to help families, going to finish what you and great-grandpa started. The pride and terror of that statement, pride that she'd chosen purpose over easier paths, terror at the weight she'd carry, the fight she'd face, the price she'd pay for standing. But he couldn't protect her from choosing meaning, couldn't shelter her from the costs of caring, could only teach her to stand well, to fight wisely, to honor the work while maintaining her humanity. You'll be great at it. I learned from the best. 7 years after the trial, Michael stood in William's study, watching sunset paint the walls gold. The yellow pins still marked victims. The maps still showed connections. The evidence still documented 40 years of conspiracy, but now it served as teaching tool, as reminder, and as proof that one person's determination could matter. Frank had died the previous winter. Heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful end for a man who'd lived with violence and guilt. He'd been 75. Had spent the last 7 years making up for 27 years of failure. Had died knowing he'd honored Margaret, had honored William, had helped build something that mattered. His funeral had been attended by hundreds. Victim families, center staff, FBI agents who'd worked with him decades earlier. Community members who'd learned to respect the old Marine who'd found redemption in service. Lily had spoken at the funeral. 15 years old, poised beyond her years, she talked about Frank as grandfather she'd chosen, about lessons he taught, about chess games and rifle practice and quiet conversations about what it meant to stand for something. She'd ended with story about the first time Frank told her he loved her. She'd been 9, had asked if he'd be her grandpa since great-grandpa Bill was gone. Frank had gotten tears in his eyes and said he'd be honored, that she'd saved him, that finding family had given him reason to keep living. I didn't save him, Lily had told the mourners. He saved himself by choosing to help my dad, by choosing to honor great-grandpa's work, by choosing to stand up after 27 years of sitting down. That's what I learned from him, that it's never too late to choose better, to do right, to make your life mean something. The words had devastated Michael, his daughter understanding grace and redemption better than most adults, understanding that people were complex, that failure didn't define you unless you let it, that choosing to try, even late, mattered more than perfect record. Now, standing in William's study, Michael felt Frank's absence, felt the hole left by the old FBI agent who'd become friend and partner and family, felt the weight of carrying forward work they'd built together. But he also felt gratitude, gratitude that Frank had lived long enough to see the center thrive, to see cases solved, to see families helped, to know his 27 years of guilt had been transformed into 7 years of purpose, to die knowing he'd made amends, had honored Margaret, had finished the work he'd started when he'd kept William's evidence against orders. Sarah Chen had become operations director after Frank's death. She ran the center with efficiency Frank had taught her. Balanced compassion with pragmatism. maintained standards while adapting to growth. She'd married the previous year, local man who understood her work, who supported her mission, who'd accepted that she came with targets and risks and weight. Alona Morrison had written second book, this one about the center, about the 7 years of cases, about the families helped and the ones still waiting, about the ordinary people who'd chosen to fight, about the proof that justice was possible when systems functioned and people cared. The book had sparked national conversation about missing persons, about how some victims mattered less to official systems, about racial and economic disparities and who got investigated and who got forgotten, about the need for independent accountability when institutions failed. New centers had opened in 17 states, using Williams' model, building on the Harper Center's example, creating network of citizens who investigated when officials wouldn't, who demanded answers when systems preferred silence, who proved that ordinary people could hold extraordinary power accountable. 10 years after the trial, Michael stood on the ranch porch watching his daughter drive away. Lily was 18 now, heading to college, University of Montana, criminal justice major, already planning to return after graduation, already committed to the center, already choosing the wait. The truck disappeared down the road, red taillights fading into distance. Michael felt the absence, the quiet, the shift from active parenting to empty nest, the strange grief of successful fatherhood, raising a child to leave. Frank's voice echoed in memory. You're more like him than you know. Talking about William, about the old rancher who'd built something knowing he wouldn't see it complete, who'd sacrificed everything trusting someone would care enough to finish. Michael understood that now. Understood legacy wasn't about completion, was about building foundation, about starting something larger than yourself, about trusting that others would carry forward what you began. He'd finished Williams' immediate work, had convicted Blackwell, had built the center, had helped families. But the work wasn't finished, would never be finished. There would always be missing people, always be families seeking answers, always be powerful people believing they were above accountability. The fight would continue long after Michael was gone, long after Lily was gone, long after the center itself became history. But each case solved mattered. Each family helped mattered. Each proof that justice was possible mattered. That was the inheritance, not the ranch, not the building, not even the center itself, but the idea, the proof, the example that ordinary people could stand, could fight, could win. That power didn't grant immunity. That wealth didn't excuse evil. That one person with determination could change the trajectory of lives and communities and systems. William had proved it first, had built the case knowing he might never see justice. Michael had finished what William started, had proved the system could work when people pushed it to work. Now Lily's generation would carry it forward, would adapt it, would make it theirs while honoring what came before. The sun set over Thunder Ridge Ranch, gold light on grassland and mountains. The house stood solid. The barn rose strong. The center buzzed with activity even as the evening approached. Investigators working late, families seeking answers, files being organized, cases being built. Inside William's study, the yellow pins remained. 30 victims, 30 names, 30 people who'd been forgotten until one old rancher decided they mattered enough to remember. 30 families who'd gotten answers because someone had cared enough to look. But the wall had grown. New pins now, different colors, cases the center had taken on. Red for active investigations, blue for solved, green for families reunited with missing who'd been found alive. The wall had become map of work continuing, proof that William's sacrifice had multiplied beyond his original 30. Michael walked through the center one last time before heading home, saw Sarah reviewing case files, saw investigators preparing for tomorrow's interview, saw photographs of missing people whose families still waited, saw evidence of work that would continue whether he was there or not. That was success, building something that didn't require him, that functioned through systems and trained people and proven methods. That would outlast his involvement. That would carry forward the mission long after he'd stepped back. Outside, Montana night was vast and dark and full of stars. The same stars William had watched, the same sky that covered the graves of 30 victims, the same darkness that had witnessed 40 years of conspiracy and 7 years of justice and 10 years of healing. Michael stood in that darkness feeling small and significant simultaneously. Small against the scope of time and space and history. Significant because he'd chosen to stand. Because he'd finished what his grandfather started. Because he'd helped build something that mattered. The inheritance wasn't the ranch. The inheritance was the fight. The choice to stand when standing was hard. The commitment to truth when truth was costly. The refusal to accept that some lives mattered less than others. William had given him that, had modeled it through sacrifice, had preserved it through evidence, had trusted that someone would care enough to finish. Michael had honored that trust, had finished the work, had made the sacrifice matter, had built something larger than revenge or justice, had built proof that ordinary people could change the world. And now Lily would carry it forward, would make it hers, would teach her own children someday, would ensure the lesson persisted. That legacy was immortal, would outlast buildings and organizations, would survive as long as people remembered, as long as someone believed ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil, as long as someone refused to accept that power granted immunity. The stars wheeled overhead, the wind whispered through grass, Thunder Ridge Ranch stood silent and purposeful, home to ghosts who could finally rest, home to living who chose to fight, home to work that would never truly finish but always mattered. Michael Brennan walked toward the house, toward the life he'd built from ruins, toward the future that honored the past, toward tomorrow's fights and challenges and victories. He was 45 years old, sober 10 years, father to a daughter who'd chosen purpose, builder of systems that help people, keeper of his grandfather's flame. And somewhere in whatever came after death, William Harper watched his grandson live the legacy, watched the work continue, watched ordinary people prove that truth mattered, that justice was possible, that one person's determination could ripple across generations. The fight wasn't finished, would never be finished, but the fight was being fought by people who chose to stand, by systems built to help, by families who refused to forget. That was enough. That was everything. That was the inheritance. And Michael Brennan had proved himself worthy of it.